Chapter 584. Black blood sprayed onto the purple grapes and dripped down to the ground, wetting the floor illuminated by the lantern light. The second prince lowered his head and opened his mouth. There was a patch of blood on his lower jaw. His eyes were lowered. Without looking at Fan Xian, he raised his hand and stopped him from walking over. The moment you enter the manor, I took the medicine. The second prince crouched on the chair with his head very low. Faintly, he said, I know you are Fei Jie's student, but the poison has already entered my heart. You can't save me. I also don't want you to save me. You have to know that although you are powerful, you can't stop me from dying. As long as a person had the will to die, no matter what method was used, it was impossible to save his life. Fan Xian understood this. He looked at the other person calmly. His heart was empty and had no thoughts. However, he was still not prepared to watch with folded arms. It was not because he had a glimmer of brotherly affection for the second prince. Rather, he could not let the other person die in front of him. Don't worry about anything. I have already written my will earlier. The palace will not blame you. No one will think you killed me. The second prince lowered his head. His blood-stained hand fumbled in his clothes and pulled out a letter. Gently, he placed it on the table. Unexpectedly, before he died, he had even thought of what Fan Xian was worried about. Fan Xian's heart froze slightly. He knew that the other person was as Ling said. He was ruthless toward himself to a certain realm and had cut off any hope of survival. The second prince raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian with an envious gaze. He then vomited up another mouthful of black blood. He used his sleeve to carelessly wipe his lips. Using two slender fingers, he carefully broke off the grapes stained by the poisonous blood. Leaving behind a small, clean half, he sent it back into his mouth. The sweet and juicy grapes were chewed into mush in his mouth. The second prince spat out the grape seeds. He spat them onto the ground, still carrying black blood. After eating the grapes, he wiped his hands clean on his body and sighed. Looking at Fan Xian, who had been silent and not moving, he faintly said, I don't want to continue living as a joke. Fan Xian nodded to indicate that he understood his thoughts. Actually, you're also a joke. A layer of deathly gray gradually rose to the second prince's face. His gaze was slightly unfocused. Thinking of something, he said, there are a lot of people in Jingdo who want to kill you. Yes, the first person to act was me. But do you think Cheng Qian has been gentle toward you? The Qin family didn't kill you in the valley. He was so angry he jumped all night in the Eastern Palace. But why? He stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Why is it that your attitude toward Cheng Qian is completely different from how you treat me? Fan Xian himself did not understand this point. The second prince was about to die, and his words were also straightforward. They pierced straight into his heart. Why was it that he had always been so tolerant and gentle toward the crown prince, but pestered the second prince relentlessly and spared no expense? The second prince's eyelids drooped weakly, and his voice was extremely low. You don't like me. You didn't like me from the beginning. Of course, I don't like you either. The two of us are too similar. It's just that I've never had such good luck as you. No matter who it is, no one will allow another to exist in the world. Everyone will unconsciously try to get rid of the other first. His gaze was cold and helpless. If you are Prince Jia of the Rongba Manor, then I can only be Zhen Baoyu of Jinling. I will never get many chances to appear in the novel, but I am the real one. I am the real one. As the second prince spoke, he coughed up blood. The blood was smeared all over the front of his clothes. He appeared very wretched. Fan Xian looked at the scene in front of him. His body was stiff, and he couldn't make any reaction. The second prince raised his head for the last time and stared at Fan Xian's face. With some difficulty, he said, I always thought Cheng Qian was the most cowardly of all the brothers. Only when I was about to die did I realize that I was also very cowardly. I would rather die and humbly leave Ling and Mother than have the courage to face, after I die, help me take care of Ling As for Mother, her best ending is probably to be banished into the cold palace. Please help me take care of her. The second prince's chest rose and fell violently as if something was about to charge out. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and forced himself to finish speaking. He didn't give Fan Xian any chance to speak. Opening his mouth, he spat out a large pool of black blood and stopped breathing. After death, the second prince continued to crouch on the chair with his left hand on his knee. His handsome face carried a deathly ashen color. A moment later, his body fell off the chair with a thud. However, his eyes refused to close and were wide open. Fan Xian looked at the second prince's body with a numb expression. He suddenly felt that this early autumn night could be so cold. He shivered. His emotions were complicated. He didn't know what kind of sigh he should make about the body in front of him. Perhaps silence was the best attitude. The second prince, the true prince, was already dead. How could the fake soul in his body continue? His expression was not very good. It was not because the second prince had committed suicide in front of him, nor was it because of the heart-wrenching words the second prince had said before he died. Rather, in the end, the second prince had asked him to help him take care of Ling and Lady Shu. He didn't even give him a chance to refuse? Fan Xian thought to himself. His expression was desolate. When the eldest princess died, she gave one to him. The crown prince knew that he was going to die, so he entrusted the families of the rebel soldiers and officials to him. Why? Don't you know that I am your irreconcilable enemy? Was your death not caused by me? Why do you throw so many burdens at me before you die? Do you want to crush me to death? Are you betting that I will help you? You dead people. If you die, then die. Why do you want me, a living person, to live so uncomfortably? He lowered his head and was incomparably wooden. His body trembled slightly. He then walked to the side of the second prince's body and glanced at it. He picked up the thin wool from the table and put it into his clothes. Then he walked out of the sinister room. Walking to the bedroom in the back garden of the manor, Yiling was still sitting woodenly under the cold light of the green lantern. She had no idea what had happened in the back garden. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and walked directly behind her. Striking down with his palm, he didn't give her any chance to react before knocking her out. If he didn't knock her out, once she learned of the second prince's suicide by poison, she would probably follow him. Fan Xian could only use this more direct method to delay the matter. Gong Dian came forward to greet him. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then handed the will and his clothes to him. At the same time, he handed Yiling who was on his shoulder, to him and said something in a low voice. Gong Dian accepted the unconscious Yiling. He was already very shocked. Hearing the news of the second prince's death, he furrowed his brows tightly. The second prince wrote a will. The emperor won't blame you or me. Fan Xian sighed. Immediately after, he said seriously, before Wang Fei wakes up, first tie up her hands and feet. Then tell her this news. If she doesn't want to eat, force rice soup down my throat. No matter what, she has to drink it. These last two sentences had already been roared out through gritted teeth. They were incomparably sinister. Gong Dian thought that this was indeed the only way. He didn't notice the Duke of Dambua's loss of composure. After thinking for a moment, he helplessly said, "But the young lady's personality is like a raging fire. We can't tie her up for the rest of her life. Fire is not scary. It comes quickly and goes quickly. It's not as piercing as a lump of ice like me and the second prince." Fan Xian thought to himself. Lowering his voice, he said, "After a few days, when things have calmed down a bit, I'll come and try to persuade her." After he finished dealing with the matters of the manor, the night in Jingdo had gradually receded. It was already early in the morning. In the distant east, a faint sliver of white peeked out. However, Fan Xian had no way of resting. He still had too many things to do. After circling back to the Fan Manor from the manor, he went directly to the royal palace. Although Minister Fan had said that these matters should be handled by the Board of Rites Taichung Temple, Fan Xian could not forget his identity as regent and pretend these things had never happened. Furthermore, he was also the vice minister of Taichung Temple, Minister Run Shao, and had followed the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven. He didn't know if he would survive. He and the great prince stood side by side. Looking at the three black coffins in front of them, the two brothers were silent. Just a day ago, the two of them had been standing on the palace walls worrying about the safety of the palace and the world of the Qin kingdom. Who would have thought that at this moment, victory and defeat had already been decided? The people who wrote the history of the world had already changed their names. Who would have thought that at the moment of danger in the royal palace, the black coffins under Fan Xian's feet had already begun to contain the skin of the defeated? The eldest princess and the second prince were lying quietly in the coffins. There was another coffin that was empty. No one knew who was going to lie in it next. This is not in accordance with etiquette. The great prince's expression was heavy. He struggled not to show sorrow between his brows. The eldest princess was one thing, but the brotherly affection between him and the second prince, Li Chengze, could not be faked. Although the two brothers had gradually drifted apart during these 2 years, looking at the scene in front of him and thinking of the people in the coffins, the great prince's heart still ached. Fan Xian nodded his head tiredly and said, "The officials of the Board of Rites have all been scared away. It looks like as long as the emperor doesn't return to the capital, the 6 ministries will not be able to be gathered together. There aren't many people in Taichung Temple either. They are just temporary accommodations. After all, the face of the royal family has to be taken care of. They can't just stay in the manor." The great prince sighed and didn't say anything more. He turned and walked into the royal palace. Compared to the group of imperial soldiers escorting the coffins, his figure appeared very desolate. Fan Xian looked at him calmly and shook his head. He knew that in the face of the repeated heavy pressure and the gradually arriving news of death, the great prince was almost unable to hold out. Thinking of this, only then did Fan Xian feel waves of exhaustion coming from the depths of his body. He could barely keep his eyelids open. Furrowing his brows, he slapped his face and said to the subordinate beside him, "Return to the manor." In one night, he had returned to the manor 4 times, but there was not a moment of peace. Fan Xian thought about it carefully. From the beginning of the preparations before breaking into the palace, he had not slept for 2 days and 2 nights. His injuries had already relapsed. The power of the ephedra pill had completely worn off. He didn't dare take it again. His entire body's energy and strength had indeed reached their limits. After returning to the manor, Fan Xian looked at everything in the dark night. He didn't go to see Wan who was staying in Lady Lu's room. He lowered his head and sat silently on the bed for a while. He then kicked the black chest under the bed. Without even taking off his clothes, he lay down with his arms spread out. He was clearly exhausted, yet he couldn't sleep. He opened his bright eyes and looked at the dark ceiling. He didn't sleep for long before he woke up. After all, Jingdo was still in chaos. As the regent, he could not give himself too much time to rest and be sad. After getting out of bed, he randomly ate something and used a hot towel to soak his face, forcefully recovering his energy. As he walked out the door, he unconsciously glanced down at the bed. That fatal chest, the chest that often stayed in the dust, lay quietly under the bed. It was like the eldest princess and second prince lying quietly in their coffins. No one would ever disturb them again. Regardless of whether it was a chest or a person, perhaps only by becoming an unremarkable existence and placed in an unremarkable place could they obtain true peace. As he left the manor, he unconsciously glanced back inside. After returning from Taiping Courtyard, he still hadn't seen Wan He didn't know what his wife's mood was. Thinking of this, a glimmer of darkness rose to his face. As he entered the palace, he unconsciously glanced toward the palace doors. There were fire and smoke marks everywhere on the red palace doors. Some of the cracks caused by weapons were gaping open, revealing the wood shavings inside. The copper nails that had been knocked off had long been cleaned up. There were only countless ugly scars left on the doors. In this instant, Fan Xian confirmed some things. This palace, this city, and this country were, after all, the place he had lived for 20 years. He had already developed deep feelings for this place. Even though this palace was cold and gloomy, even though this city had let down many people, and even though this country had made a great mistake, it was still his country. He had always thought of himself as a Qing person. There were many things that he had not investigated clearly. Before he understood them, he didn't mind doing his best to maintain the peace of the people in this country while he lived a beautiful life, just as he had done all these years. So many people had died, so he had to live well. unless some people didn't want him to live. He invited the scholars Hu and Shu back to their manors to temporarily rest. These two officials had already been in the royal study drafting up the imperial edicts for an entire night. Some of the important memorials to the Qing kingdom had finally been roughly sorted out. However, the two scholars were not made of iron. Their mental state was much worse than Fan Xian's. After receiving a series of shocks and not sleeping, they were long exhausted. Fan Xian sat in the empty royal study and couldn't help but shake his head. Usually, when the emperor was here, although the royal study was just as quiet, it was always filled with a different feeling. Was it dignity? Or something else? In any case, it was completely different from the royal study he sensed. He didn't know how the emperor had come down from Dong Mountain alive, but he knew that his performance would certainly satisfy the emperor. It looked like his position as a powerful official could be secured. However, when he thought of the war that would open the curtains in 2 or 3 years, Fan Xian felt a bit of bitterness in his mouth. It was said that a gentleman did not bully a darkroom. However, Fan Xian was not a gentleman. He sat alone in the royal study, looking at the mountainous piles of memorials on the low platform and the soft couch. He thought of how the emperor had been controlling the entire Qing kingdom's court politics from there. His heart jumped. He stood up and looked calmly in that direction. Slightly tilting his head, he wondered what it would feel like if he sat there. Immediately after, he shook his head. His thin lips twitched slightly, revealing a glimmer of self-mockery. Being regent for a day and night had almost tired him out like a big yellow dog in the summer. Looking at the wretched appearance of the scholars Hu and Shu being supported by the eunuchs, Fan Xian confirmed that the emperor's job was certainly more tiring than that of the Yellow Emperor, who had countless women every day. It was still that old saying. There are only 3 kinds of people in the world: men, women, and the emperor. Anyone who could be a true ruler was not a person. Invite the 3rd prince over. Fan Xian smiled slightly and spoke to the little eunuch outside the royal study. He immediately thought of Hong Zhu and some of the people involved in the rebellion who were still imprisoned in the Cold Palace. He didn't know how the emperor would handle this matter after he returned. However, in the eyes of an outsider, Hong Zhu had basically done nothing, so there shouldn't be any major problems. In just a few years, the 3rd prince, Li Changping, who had gradually grown into a youthful appearance, arrived outside the royal study accompanied by an old nanny and a few eunuchs. Fan Xian glanced at the old nanny and waved his hand for them to leave. Holding the 3rd prince's hand, he came to the front of the desk where the memorials were kept. Li Changping's hand was slightly cold. The gaze with which he looked at Fan Xian was also different from when he was in Jiangnan. It appeared to be somewhat respectful. Fan Xian had already noticed this scene out of the corner of his eye, but he did not care much. He was respectful and fearful, but there was no sense of alienation. He knew that his performance this day and night had left a deep impression on this brother of his. He would probably never be able to shake off this kind of mark. This was a problem in education. Other than Fan Xian, no one in this world understood it. In order to raise a prince who dared to open a brothel and kill people at the age of 9 into a kind ruler, pure moral teachings were not enough to complete the task. He had to let the 3rd prince understand that there were many things in this world that could be achieved through more open and above-board methods. The 3rd prince needed a role model. From the beginning of the Jiangnan trip, Fan Xian had set himself as the role model in the 3rd prince's heart because he was an immortal poet, a warrior, a powerful official, and the savior of the 3rd prince. In the hearts of most of the people of Qing Kingdom, he was a good person. Fan Xian hoped that the future emperor of Qing Kingdom would also be a good person, just like the crown prince. Sir, I heard father. Li Changping looked at Fan Xian with some fear. Fan Xian smiled. With the temple above, the emperor has the mandate of heaven to protect him. Naturally, those thieves and rascals cannot harm him. Oh, a glimmer of joy rose to Li Changping's face. Although he knew that if his father died, he would become the next emperor of Qing Kingdom under the protection of his teacher and brother, he was, after all, still a youth. His thoughts were not that ruthless. Fan Xian pretended not to care, but he carefully paid attention to the change of emotions in Li Changping's eyes. He thought to himself that he had indeed not seen wrong. In the future, the emperor will probably often have you come to the royal study to listen. After Fan Xian said this, he paused and slowly opened his mouth to say, "Your Highness should first familiarize yourself with the place." The third prince had come to the royal study before, and knew that his brothers, the crown prince, his second brother, his eldest brother, and even his teacher would always listen to his father and the officials discuss matters in the royal study after the court meeting. However, after today, this royal study would probably be much emptier. There are many things that probably no one dares to say to your highness, Fan Xian said calmly after thinking for a moment. But I must tell you, the emperor was about to return. Fan Xian had to give his own explanation to the third prince because he knew that this child's thoughts were actually very meticulous. Earlier, he had always used your highness to refer to him. The great prince's nature is martial. In the future, he will be sent to the borders to guard. Fan Xian's expression was slightly heavy. Using his own words, he described the emperor's future plans. His nature is straightforward. He will not take the initiative to do anything that will harm the Brotherhood. You can rest assured on this point. Don't be suspicious. The third prince's hand trembled. Looking at his teacher's face, he didn't know why he was suddenly saying this. As for me, I will eventually leave. The world is so big. I have to go to the ends of the earth to take a look. Only then will I not have wasted my life. Fan Xian smiled slightly. So, don't be suspicious of me. Even after you grow up, don't be suspicious of me. The third prince opened his mouth wide. For some reason, he felt a glimmer of fear. These are not words that an official should say. Fan Xian withdrew his smile and calmly said, "But I want to say it to you. In the 20 years of my life, I have grown tired of guessing and testing each other's intentions. Regardless of whether or not you still believe these words when you grow up, please remember these words." Just as he had said, these words had already violated the emperor's family's great taboo. Furthermore, they had come from the mouth of an official. Yet, Fan Xian had said them so calmly and naturally. Li Chongping looked in a daze at his teacher's originally handsome but slightly sallow face and unconsciously nodded his head. 3 days had passed. Jingdo had already been pacified. The three riders once again entered the capital and announced to the world the news of the emperor's return from worshipping heaven. The Jingdo people, still shaken, were overjoyed. Standing on the palace walls, Fan Xian didn't know what they were happy about after suffering so much. The emperor's scheduled return to the capital was 3 days late. During these 3 days, the Dingzhou army's military intelligence reports came endlessly to the capital through the military and Overwatch Council's channels. Fan Xian had enough of being a regent. With both hands, he held the emperor's royal seal and randomly stamped it. On this day, the news finally arrived. Fan Xian brought the third prince, the great prince, and the surviving royalist old officials through the streets that still had the marks of war. Walking out of Xingyang Gate, they stopped 10 li away. Thousands of people knelt down densely. There was no space on the road. Many people knelt directly in the wheat fields on either side of the road. At this time, the autumn harvest had not arrived. The golden ears of wheat survived the trampling of the war horses and swayed in the wind with the heavy harvest. Countless people's emotions swayed like the ears of wheat as they watched the bright yellow royal entourage coming from afar. Fan Xian pulled his gaze back from the wheat fields and smiled slightly at the nervous and joyful third prince beside him. After canvassing for votes yesterday, I rushed to second place in the monthly votes. In my memory, this seems to be the first time in the Qingyu year that I have reached second place. Although the second prince died, quite tragically today, I am still as nervous and joyful as the third prince. Alas, I have lived most of my life as a bachelor. Thank you. Chapter 585. The royal carriage slowly arrived and steadily stopped on the road. Because of the chaos and panic of the battle, the road had not been paved with yellow earth or sprinkled with water. However, the emperor's feet still did not have any hesitation. Firmly and steadily, he walked down the steps and stepped onto the land around Jingdo. The emperor moved his hand away from eunuch Yao's elbow. His calm gaze slowly swept across the wilderness. Thousands of officials and soldiers were kneeling on the ground and worshiping him. His expression was indifferent, but there was not much emotion in his eyes. Amidst the earth-shaking mountain cries, the emperor's gaze moved closer from the distant Jingdo walls and landed nearby. It flashed past the scholars Hu and Shu, the great prince in martial attire, and his nervous and slightly happy youngest son. In the end, it lightly landed on Fan Xian's handsome and threatening face. He noticed that there was a strong sense of tiredness on this boy's face. The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly with a hint of joy. It was as if he was growing to like this pretty face more and more in the depths of his heart. His brows immediately furrowed because he found that Fan Xian had suffered a serious internal injury. Spreading out his bright yellow dragon robe, the emperor stretched out his arms. Calmly and domineeringly, he faced the wilderness in front of him. The mountain cries gradually stopped. If no one dared to look at the emperor, how could these thousands of people know the emperor's actions? From the moment they got out of the car, the emperor's gaze had basically landed on Fan Xian. Fan Xian felt uncomfortable all over, but he kept his head down. He didn't know how to react. After hearing the cheers, the emperor's feet gradually moved toward them. Just as he was about to walk in front of Fan Xian, the emperor suddenly changed his direction and did not look at Fan Xian again. Solemnly, he helped Shu Wu and Hu the scholar to their feet. His hands gripped old Shu's shoulders. Using a gentle and firm tone, he said, "You've suffered." Shu Wu's heart jumped. Fear appeared on his face. Hu the scholar also repeatedly said he didn't dare. The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. Immediately after, he helped up the great prince, who had led the soldiers in the Jingdo battle and achieved great merit. The emperor's emotions toward this eldest son he had never liked much were complicated, but his expression was calm. Following this, the emperor pulled Li Chengping up and used his right hand to gently stroke his youngest son's head for a while. His gaze looked around at the officials loyal to him and didn't say a word. Then, he turned around and walked back to the royal carriage. Everyone was dumbfounded, thinking that it was over just like that. It was not about whether or not the emperor's return ceremony had finished. Rather, it was about the most meritorious service in protecting the country, the Duke of Danbua, still kneeling stiffly on the ground. Why did the emperor not say anything at all? Shu Wu and Hu the scholar met each other's eyes and saw the confusion in each other's eyes. Fan Xian was also a bit confused. He didn't know if he should stand up. "Get up. Could it be that you won't be able to stand up if I don't help you up?" Before he boarded the royal carriage, the emperor lightly tossed out these words to the crowd. Although these words did not point to anyone, everyone knew that they were directed at Fan Xian. Furthermore, they appeared cold, but in reality, there was a sliver of closeness within. As for the other meaning hidden in these words, only Fan Xian could understand. The emperor had already recognized his ability and loyalty. Without needing his support, he could also stand in his own position in court. Fan Xian laughed bitterly and stood up. He lowered his head to look at the dirt on his knees. Logically speaking, the emperor had not yet boarded the carriage. As an official, he could not clean up his appearance. However, an impulse came from somewhere and made his right hand brush at his knees, brushing away some of the dirt. This small action did not attract too much attention. It made the emperor's figure, who was about to board the royal carriage, pause slightly. Then, everyone heard the emperor's words. "Enji, come into the carriage." The officials began to stare dumbfounded again. They looked at each other and sank into shock. Earlier, the emperor had not personally helped Fan Xian stand up. Everyone had some guesses. Who would have thought that the emperor would immediately give Sir Fan Jr. such an honor to follow the emperor into the capital? What kind of honor was this? Even the crown prince had never enjoyed it in the past. The gazes of the clever officials toward Fan Xian became heated. However, these officials appeared too clever, or perhaps they thought they were clever. Some of their gazes involuntarily landed on the third prince. Everyone knew that the crown prince and the second prince would not have a good ending because of the rebellion. At the beginning, Everyone thought that the future master of the Qing kingdom would be this young prince. Looking at the emperor's attitude, the reason these officials thought they were clever was because they had displayed an inappropriate attitude in an inappropriate place. The scholars Hu and Shu looked down as if they had not heard the emperor's words at all. This was the difference between high-ranking officials and officials. Fan Xian tasted bitterness in his mouth, but he could not go against the imperial edict. He walked to the side of the tall royal carriage, lifted the yellow curtain, and stood in front of the emperor. Although the royal carriage was tall, it was still unable to allow a person to stand straight. Thus, he was forced to lower his head in front of the emperor, just like everyone else in the world. "Sit." The emperor seemed to see through his thoughts and said with a slight nod of his head. Fan Xian obeyed and sat across from the emperor. Looking at the emperor he had not seen for a month, his emotions gradually became complicated. In the past, although the emperor had also had a bright and powerful side, he was not as terrifying as the emperor now. The emperor was still calm, but he was like a bottomless abyss, hiding an unfathomable power. This kind of feeling made Fan Xian's heart palpitate. Looking at the two straight eyebrows and calm eyes, he involuntarily felt the thought of retreating rise in his heart. The emperor's domineering aura did not appear from his outer appearance. Instead, it appeared in the history books through his methods and results. To be able to come back alive from Dong Mountain, to be able to arrange such a situation, and to be such a powerful figure, he was indeed worthy of being the foremost person in the land in 30 years. Fan Xian understood this reality and could only accept it. The middle-aged man wearing the dragon robe lowered his head to look at the urgent memorials the two scholars had presented. He did not pay attention to Fan Xian's gaze toward him, even if this kind of gaze toward the emperor was extremely impolite and taboo. The royal carriage slowly began to move. The light from outside the window slanted in and shone on the memorials in the emperor's hands. He lowered his head and furrowed his brows as he looked at these things. Suddenly, he said, 3 years. My Qing kingdom still needs 3 years. When he said this, the emperor did not raise his head. It was as if he was talking to himself. Fan Xian knew what the emperor meant. After experiencing an internal rebellion, putting aside the serious damage Jingdo had suffered in the chaos of court politics, just the internal attacks in the military had already caused serious consequences. The military's morale was already unstable. Additionally, the officials in the Dongshan Road area involved many people. Although the emperor had already chosen good officials from Jiangnan to replace them, the impact on the people's lives would certainly be great. It would take at least a year to gather the military's morale and remove the psychological effects of this chaos. The Qing kingdom would need at least 3 years to truly prepare for a large-scale battle in terms of wealth, resources, and the hearts of the people. Presumably, in the emperor's heart, this northern expedition to unify the world would be the last one. The progress of history that had been stopped by the two great grandmasters for over 20 years would slowly speed up. The light from outside the window shone in through the glass and endlessly brushed back, sprinkling countless glass flowers on the father and son's faces. The emperor still had his head down and said, "When the matter is done, brush off one's clothes and leave, hide one's body and name deeply." These are the words he once wrote. However, don't hope that I will let you go. When a matter is done, the matter is not over. Why is a young man like you in a hurry to brush off your clothes and leave? The emperor's eyes looked at the memorial. These words seemed to have been spoken unintentionally, but Fan Xian's heart thumped. He didn't know what to say. When a matter was done, brush off one's clothes and leave. He had not thought that his unconsciously brushing off the dust in front of the royal carriage would allow the emperor to guess his thoughts. Furthermore, the emperor had resolutely and mercilessly dispelled his illusions or probing in his heart. He laughed bitterly and didn't dare to hide anything. Straightforwardly, he said, "I am truly not good at things like fighting wars. It's better to peacefully earn some money for the court." Fan Xian had other plans in his heart, so he rushed to speak clearly. Unexpectedly, the emperor suddenly raised his head and looked at him. "Don't think about resigning. If you are still afraid of what people say, I will naturally do the matter of reducing your power." Fan Xian cried out bitterly in his heart. The emperor's words had forced him into a corner. If he was truly forced to stay in Jingdo to plot, he did not want his power to be reduced. The Overwatch Council was the most powerful weapon in his hands. If the emperor actually tore it open, what would he use to negotiate terms with this unfathomable emperor? Until now, he still didn't know the truth of what happened on Dong Mountain. He didn't dare to open his mouth to ask in the carriage. It was the emperor who spoke first and asked about the specific situation in Jingdo. Although Jingdo had continuously sent memorials to the royal carriage during these 3 days, the matter involved the secret of the royal family. There were many things that could only be reported personally by Fan Xian to the emperor. Fan Xian's voice rang out in the carriage. From the moment he left Dong Mountain to when he disguised himself as an oil merchant to enter Jingdo, to the later plan with the Great Prince, the surprise attack on the royal palace, and finally the Yi family's attack, he spoke methodically and clearly. He purposely downplayed some details that the emperor presumably did not want to hear. When Fan Xian made his report, the emperor had already lowered his head again. That was why he carefully watched the emperor's expression and reaction. Unexpectedly, regardless of whether it was the news of the eldest princess' death or the second prince's suicide, none of them made the emperor's stone-like face tremble at all. It was only when he reported the Empress Dowager's illness that the emperor raised his head. How many days does the Empress Dowager have left? I've seen her at the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Her body is weak, and she has experienced such a major event. She has been frightened. I'm afraid. Fan Xian stopped talking. He had a malicious thought toward the cold emperor. The Empress Dowager was scared to death by you. What should you, as a filial emperor, do? The Imperial Academy of Medicine? The emperor furrowed his brows and looked at him coldly. What is the use of those pieces of trash? You were in the palace. Don't you know the details? Fan Xian said darkly. It is indeed not something a person can reverse. Under the gazes and protection of countless people, the emperor's entourage entered Jingdo. Following the wide and straight Tianhe Avenue, it entered the royal palace. Along the way, the common people who had just suffered the disaster of war forcefully suppressed the sorrow or fear in their hearts and joyfully welcomed the emperor's return. It was as if they were welcoming back the backbone of their lives. From this, it could be seen that the emperor's prestige and reputation among the Qing people was still as strong and unbreakable as monarchical power itself. Arriving at the front doors of the royal palace, Fan Xian retreated from the carriage with his body bent. Meeting the great prince's gaze, he shook his head, indicating that the emperor's mood was fine and had not been affected by the successive news of deaths. Fan Xian followed the carriage into the palace. Looking at the bright yellow curtains, he couldn't help but think of the emperor's expression earlier. Involuntarily, he felt a chill in his heart. Although the eldest princess and the second prince were both the masterminds of the rebellion, they were, after all, the emperor's own sister and son. Furthermore, looking at the rebellion now, it was clear that the emperor had purposely set up a trap for the other party. Yet, after learning of the death of his sister and son, the emperor was still calm. This determination, this cold-bloodedness, truly made him shiver in fear. The great prince walked to his side and said in a heavy voice, "Why did you come down? Did you dare to sit all the way into the palace?" Fan Xian glanced at him and explained in a low voice. The emperor asked some questions in the carriage. You know that it is not convenient to announce these things in public. There was originally no need to explain anything to the great prince. However, Fan Xian looked at the gazes focused on him from all around. He knew what kind of discussion and consequences it would cause if he followed the royal entourage into the capital, so he unconsciously added this sentence. After he finished, he felt that talking to the great prince like this would probably have the opposite effect. He smiled bitterly and said, "It was too cold in the carriage, so I came down to stretch my bones." The great prince smiled and patted his shoulder. He didn't say anything. These two brothers were actually both forcing themselves to smile. Guarding Jingdo to prevent the ruler of a country from becoming a lonely spirit in the land. Without question, they had performed a great service, a great service. However, so many people in the royal family had died, and they had used so many tricks. Who knew what the emperor was thinking? The Qing emperor didn't think of anything. In the process of arranging to wipe out the rebel army outside the capital, he had already learned of Li Yunrui and Li Cheng's death from the urgent documents Fan Xian had sent. In the carriage, he only learned the specific circumstances of their deaths from Fan Xian's mouth. His expression was calm, as if the people who had died were strangers. He continued to look at the memorials the Hall of Governmental Affairs had presented. When the royal entourage entered the palace and Fan Xian got off the carriage, the emperor put down the memorial in his hands. Leaning against the back of the chair, he closed his eyes and said nothing in silence. The lonely silence continued for a long time. A glimmer of old age and haggard gradually appeared on the emperor's face. At this moment, the carriage had already stopped in front of Han Dian. He gently sighed and slowly walked out of the carriage curtain that eunuch Yao had pulled up. Once he was out of the curtain, he looked down at the familiar yet strange palace. His expression quickly became calm and solemn. There was no longer a trace of the gloominess he had when he was alone in the carriage. Every brow and gaze conveyed his strength and strength. The Empress Dowager wore a plain white dress and lay on the warm and soft phoenix bed. The wrinkles on her face were deep. It was as if she had once faced too much wind and rain with this royal palace and had been eroded to this state. The emperor said something to the terrified imperial physician kneeling on the ground. He then sat by the side of the bed and placed his slender fingers on the Empress Dowager's wrist. Fan Xian and the other two brothers stood obediently behind the curtain, not daring to disturb them. Fan Xian's heart was faintly nervous. He could faintly see that the emperor's technique in taking the pulse was very skilled. It was clear that he also had some understanding of medicine. However, he had more confidence in Sir Fei Jie's medicine. Most importantly, that pill was not poison. Regardless of whether it was the Imperial Academy of Medicine or other brilliant doctors, presumably, none of them would be able to find the true reason for the Empress Dowager's gradual decline. Instead, they would straightforwardly conclude that she was getting old and weak and that her fate was coming to an end. The emperor's slender fingers had already left the Empress Dowager's weak pulse. He lowered his head and thought deeply for a moment. A glimmer of helplessness flashed through his eyes. It looked like this great grandmaster also knew that he could not delay his mother's departure. Then, his brows suddenly furrowed. His finger moved like the wind and tapped between the Empress Dowager's brows. With the tap, the atmosphere in Hongguang Palace changed. The cold autumn wind was dispersed by a wave of unstoppable sunlight. A powerful and upright aura passed into everyone's heart. Fan Xian suddenly felt the aura behind the curtain. His heart jumped, and his fingers began to tremble rapidly. Although this aura was not familiar, it was as harmonious as the Jinqi in his body. However, it was many levels higher than his realm. Faintly, it was the realm he had always longed for, but had never been able to find the door to. He abruptly raised his head and stared in a daze through the thin curtain. A voice in his heart cried out to him. This is the second half of the volume. This was the second half of the volume that he had practiced for 20 years, but had no progress at all. I seem to have made the same mistake as the rapeseed flower in Vermilion Bird. It looks like I am walking down the path of not distinguishing between the 5 grains. Fortunately, this is the Qing Kingdom. The title of this chapter is the second half of the father and son. Everyone should know that this is a pun. This story is about to enter the final stage. There are still about 6 or 7 more chapters in this volume. Then, it will enter the last volume, Emperor of the Dynasty. I have confidence that this is a corrected version. I mistyped the name of the last volume earlier. Chapter 586. The reason I updated late today was because of the men's basketball finals. I really couldn't help but finish reading, so I finished late. Also, at the end of the chapter, I narcissistically said 4 words, I have confidence. Then, I immediately realized that I had gotten the name of the last volume wrong. Although I changed it later, the last volume was Chaotian Tianzi. Readers with good memories should remember that I mentioned it before. After Fan Xian came to this world, he had begun to learn the nameless martial secret his mother had supposedly left for him when he was still a baby. It was a thin book with yellow pages. The martial secret was divided into 2 volumes. Wu Zhu had once said to him that the first volume was tyrannical. What about the second volume? Only an irresponsible male nanny like Wu Zhu would so casually hold such a dangerous martial secret by an infant's side. Only a strange creature like Fan Xian would begin to practice before he even knew how to run. Fan Xian took afternoon naps, and then another. 16 years of afternoon naps were 16 years of quiet cultivation. Because he was greedy for life and afraid of death, his willpower was astonishing. Even after he entered the capital, his cultivation still did not slack off. After 20 years of hard cultivation, he was as familiar with the first and second volumes of the nameless martial secret as he could be. From the age of 3, he had stopped reading books. They were all deeply imprinted in his mind. When he was 12, Wu Zhu's staff hit him, and he broke through the bottleneck of the tyrannical martial secret. After many years of life and death fighting, the shattering of his meridians in the alleys of Jingdo behind the Hanging Temple, the mutual meditation with Haidang on the trip to Jiangnan, and using the natural heart of Tianyi Dao to heal his wounds, his control of the tyrannical Jinshi had reached a near-perfect realm. Presently, he was one of the youngest 9th-level aces in the world. He knew that he was not a genius like Haidang and 13th Wang. It was just that the meridians in his body were different from others. Furthermore, he had put in time and energy that others could not. Heaven rewarded the diligent, and Fan Xian had won in the word diligent. However, he still had no way of dealing with the second half of the nameless martial secret, because the Jinshi in the second half of the book, as well as the path of circulation, appeared very strange. Never mind normal people in the world, even a strange creature like him with thick meridians had no way of dealing with it. Yes, there was a mountain of treasures in front of him, but he couldn't even find the path up the mountain because the clear light on the mountain was attracting him. However, if he wanted to climb the mountain, he would be forced to dig out this mountain. Who could do that? If the tyrannical Jinshi needed to be supported by a vast meridian, then the second half of the manual required even more terrifying. Every time Fan Xian made no progress in his cultivation, he would feel extremely disappointed. Occasionally, he would think that unless there were no meridians in the entire body, or, to put it another way, a person's meridians were all connected and scattered among the organs and limbs, it would be impossible to cultivate the second half of the scroll. For many years, Fan Xian had been troubled by this problem. He could not find any possibility of a breakthrough. Uncle Wu Zhu had never practiced Jinshi. When he was in Jiangnan, he had occasionally said a few vague words to Haidang, but Haidang only shook her head. This kind of Jinshi method required a person without meridians. It was clearly a joke. A person without meridians was, without question, a dead person. Thus, during this year, Fan Xian gradually gave up on the idea of practicing the second half of the nameless martial secret. If Wu Zhu had not told him many years ago that someone had successfully practiced this martial secret, Fan Xian would probably have thought that the second half of the nameless martial secret was a terrifying joke used by previous sages to harm people. Now, Fan Xian was outside Hongguang Palace's curtain. He clearly and with incomparable shock felt that kind of realm, a realm he had never reached or even seen before. It seeped out from behind the curtain and attacked his heart. If the tyrannical Jinshi was a mountain-splitting axe, then the aura in the curtain was like the lightning blade in the hands of God. The aura was even more pure and exquisite. It was neutral and peaceful, upright and upright. It came out of the blue and spread between heaven and earth, immediately making one feel a sense of worship. Fan Xian knew he could not be wrong. This kind of aura definitely came from the same source as the tyrannical Jinshi in his body. It was just that the realm was a few levels higher. When a realm that he had searched up and down for over a dozen years and could not understand suddenly appeared in front of his eyes, his entire body froze. He sank into some kind of imperceptible excitement. Other than excitement, he even felt a glimmer of fear. The emperor lifted the curtain and walked out. Glancing at everyone, he quietly said, "The Empress Dowager is tired." You all go wait outside the palace." No one knew what the emperor wanted to say. They bowed to receive the edict. Only Fan Xian remained standing in a daze. With his head half lowered, he looked at the emperor's dragon robe in a daze. The corners of the emperor's lips curled up slightly as he smiled. He knew that his son had sensed something. If it wasn't for the fact that this boy had been practicing the tyrannical martial method since he was young, how could anyone else have such a deep understanding and such a strong shock? Fan Xian's dazed appearance was actually mostly faked. He knew that in front of the emperor, he could not completely hide the shock in his heart. He simply let down his defenses and naturally revealed the thoughts in his mind. The emperor was a great grandmaster. The emperor had practiced the second half of the scroll. Fan Xian knew that the emperor knew that he could know, so he had to show his shock and terror. The emperor looked at him and slowly said a moment later, "Go to the Eastern Palace and wait for me. If you have anything to say, say it later." Fan Xian swallowed and smiled bitterly. After bowing, he left Hongguang Palace. The palace returned to its silence. Other than the Empress Dowager, who was lying on the bed and unable to make a single sound, there was also the emperor sitting quietly by the bed. The emperor sat silently by the Empress Dowager's side. He held her hand gently in his palm and lowered his head to think about the scene earlier. That child should know and have guessed it. The emperor had not planned to continue hiding these things from Fan Xian. After all, after the battle at Dong Mountain, there was no need to continue hiding it. Other than Fan Xian, there shouldn't be anyone else who could sense the uniqueness of the martial secret the emperor practiced. Thinking of Fan Xian's shocked expression earlier, the emperor's expression softened. He thought to himself that he had suffered all these years. He had to make it up to him. However, regarding this martial secret, even if he wanted to make it up to him, Fan Xian would not be able to accept it. He glanced at the Empress Dowager again. The emperor's expression was slightly dim. Just as Fan Xian had guessed, even a great grandmaster would not be able to sense the slightest change in the old woman's body. The secret medicine that Fei Jie had solemnly handed over indeed had its own wonders. The emperor sat by the bed thinking about something. After a long time, he suddenly opened his mouth and said in a gentle voice, "Mother, I still have many things I want to tell you and many glories I want to share with you." His hand gently held the Empress Dowager's hand. His body was not very tall and straight. On the contrary, it was slightly timid. Even the most heartless person in the world would probably feel some unease and sorrow as they watched their birth mother gradually leave this world. Faint gauze fluttered in the early autumn Hongguang Palace. The emperor's face grew paler and paler. His grip on the Empress Dowager's hand grew tighter and tighter. Large amounts of pure kingly zhenqi poured endlessly into the Empress Dowager's body. Perhaps it was the realm of a great grandmaster that could truly slow down the pace of death's arrival. Perhaps anyone would have a moment before death. The Empress Dowager's eyelids trembled slightly. Her eyeballs moved slightly. It was as if she was about to open her eyes and wake up. However, she still cannot open them. The emperor knew that this was the last time his mother would hear a sound. His body felt a chill. Kneeling properly by the bed, he held his mother's old hand with both hands. Moving his lips close to the Empress Dowager's ear, he said, "Mother, I did not disappoint you. Ku He and Sigurjian are both dead. This world will, in the end, belong to the Qing kingdom." Like a child, the emperor intimately and reluctantly recounted what had happened by the Empress Dowager's ear. He even told her his secret of being a great grandmaster. He was like a joyful child telling his mother that he had gotten full marks on today's test. He knew his mother only had a very short amount of time. He wanted her to leave more happily. At the end of his final farewell, the expression of the emperor, who was always like a collapsing mountain in front of him, suddenly became heavy. It was as if he was thinking about some important question. After thinking for a long time, he finally made up his mind. By the Empress Dowager's ear, he said, "Mother, 20 years ago, I listened to you. 20 years later, I have decided to listen to myself. And Ji is a good child." No one knew if the Empress Dowager, whose life force was gradually extinguished and whose old body was as powerless as a piece of wood, heard these words or understood the shocking news contained in them. The Empress Dowager's body suddenly froze. The Emperor furrowed his brows and turned his eyes to look at his mother's face. The Empress Dowager suddenly opened her eyes. She struggled to make a sound in her throat. Because of the loosening of her vocal cords, she could not make a sound. The last of the power of her life exploded out. It still could not allow her to break through the limit of her life. In the end, the energy in her body and the effects of the medicine only turned into endless hatred, regret, and dissatisfaction in her eyes. Fan Xian walked into the Eastern Palace and made preparations for the Emperor's arrival. He knew that the scene that was about to happen was, without question, a not uncommon scene of father and son killing each other in the 1,000-year history of the land. His heart couldn't help but chill. It was not just because of Li Chengqian's fate these years. It was also because of the facts he had learned earlier in Hongguang Palace and the Emperor's last words. If you have anything to say, say it later. A cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. The Emperor had mastered the nameless martial secret before him. He was the most mysterious great grandmaster in the palace. No wonder he had been able to return alive from Dong Mountain. No wonder he had not seen Eunuch Hong in the group returning to the capital. It looked like Hong Xixiang had already completed his historical mission. The Emperor, with the dignity of an emperor and the strength of a great grandmaster, had changed from the role of prey to the hunter on the summit of Dong Mountain. Adding on Yi Luyun, it was no wonder Siga Jian and Ku he had fallen to such a state. He sighed. His mood was dim. Once again, he confirmed the Emperor's cold-blooded heartlessness. That year, his meridians had shattered and he had almost lost his life. At the very least, he had lost all of his cultivation. The Emperor had once sent Eunuch Hong into the Fan Manor to check on his injuries. Given his great grandmaster strength, how could he not know what had happened? Furthermore, he was also someone who practiced the nameless martial secret. If there was anyone in the world who could break the side effects of the tyrannical martial secret, it could only be the Emperor. However, he had still not said anything. If it weren't for Haitong's help, he would probably be lying paralyzed in bed and unable to rise for the rest of his life. Thinking of this, Fan Xian's heart chilled again. Father has returned to the palace safely. It seems that your mood is not very good. The Crown Prince, Li Chengqian, sat behind a clean table with a warm smile on his face. He looked at Fan Xian and took a sip of the slightly cold tea. It was as if he was enjoying his last moments in the world. Fan Xian forced a smile. He kept feeling that he had heard these words somewhere before. It was as if all of his enemies could guess it. His mood was not good. The Emperor will arrive in a moment. Fan Xian looked into Li Chengqian's eyes. Li Chengqian did not shrink back in the slightest. Now that things had come to this, he no longer had any other thoughts. A few days of house arrest was enough for him to think clearly about many problems. In particular, the successive deaths of his mother and aunt made his mood as clear as a cold pond. Everyone will die. Mother is dead. Aunt is dead. Li Chengqian slowly put down the teacup in his hand and looked at Fan Xian. Father will also die in the future. It is just a matter of order. Fan Xian thought for a bit and quietly said, "The second prince is also dead." Li Chengqian lowered his head. He had been imprisoned deep in the palace and had no idea what had happened these few days. He immediately raised his head and said with a complicated expression, "I have fought with him for so many years. I didn't think that in the end, even in death, we would have to fight to be first and last. We die first and go first." Li Chengqian looked at Fan Xian and said, "Then, we will wait for you." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. He knew that they each had their own pride. Warmly, he said, "Then, you have to fight for a good position for me." Li Chengqian waved his hand confidently and said, "When one is alive, one can be as lively as one wants. Death is a lonely matter. Of course, one has to fight for one's own position." Fan Xian was slightly startled. He thought a phrase in his heart, "Live together, die alone." When he had seen this phrase in his previous life, he had always found it difficult to express the hidden meaning in Chinese. Recently, he had seen countless people die one after another and heard Li Chengqian's words. Only then did he understand that this phrase was just an overlay of countless realities. Fan Xian's heart suddenly tightened. He didn't know that in Hongguang Palace, the Empress Dowager had opened her eyes. He unconsciously looked in that direction with slight fear. If the Empress Dowager had truly woken up, he would probably be in big trouble. This fear came from the bottom of his heart. In the past, no matter who he faced, he had never been truly afraid. Now, he knew that the Emperor was a great grandmaster. One person stood at the pinnacle of the martial realm and worldly power. What difference was there between him and a god who had descended into the mortal world? Immediately after, the ringing of the bells in the royal palace rang out and resonated in all directions. Fan Xian lowered his head and silently counted the number of times the bells had rung. After confirming the news of the Empress Dowager's death, his mood relaxed slightly. Immediately, it became empty again. Opposite him, Li Chengxian had completely different news. Hearing that the Empress Dowager, who loved him the most, had also left alone, his face was slightly pale. In a trembling voice, he said to Fan Xian, "There is no need to see me off." Fan Xian raised his hands calmly in greeting and said, "Go in peace." Li Chengxian's words were not completely correct. Death was indeed the loneliest thing in the world. But before death, it was often the most lively time in the world. An old man was waiting for the god of death on his bed, while his relatives and juniors surrounded the bed, chattering nonstop. It was very annoying. The Eastern Palace was also like this. Fan Xian waited outside the palace. After a long time, he heard the dense sound of footsteps. The emperor, surrounded by many people, came to the Eastern Palace and entered alone. Li Chengxian did not stand to welcome his father. He also did not hate the liveliness before death. He refused Fan Xian's suggestion to take a risk. He did not want to go to the ends of the earth to hide his life. He also did not act like the second prince and commit suicide by taking poison before the emperor returned. He had many things he wanted to say to his father. He wanted to vent the resentment he had held in his heart for 20 years. If he could not vent it all, he would probably become a resentful ghost after death. How will the history books describe this? Li Chengxian looked at his father, the most powerful ruler in history, without a glimmer of fear. If a person did not fear death, then they would not fear anything. The crown prince, who had improved a lot these 2 years, said straightforwardly, "I waited for you to come back because I wanted to know if you truly did not care about anything." The Qing emperor, dressed in casual clothes, looked calmly at his son and said, "The history books are always written by the victors. Furthermore, do you think I have wronged you in any way?" The crown prince sat behind the clean table and furrowed his brows in thought for a long time. He then smiled and shook his head. "Of course not. Mother was weak, but you still made me crown prince and let me sit in this position for so many years. Of course, you have not wronged me." This was not the truth because the thick mockery in it was completely revealed. The emperor coldly said, "Don't learn the cowardly and sour words of women." Cowardly? That was forced by you. You are too dazzling. No one dares to steal your glory. The crown prince closed his eyes and stubbornly said, "I have always thought of a question. Since you have never thought of passing your power to the next generation, why did you make me crown prince?" The emperor's expression was unusually calm. He stared at him and slowly said, "Chengxian, you disappoint me. All these years, I've been training you nonstop. What's the reason?" Chapter 587. Fan Xian walked out of the Eastern Palace and turned around to personally close the 2 heavy palace doors. He glanced at the densely packed crowd surrounding the Eastern Palace. His expression was calm, but an unknown emotion rolled through his heart. After he calmed down slightly, he waved his hand toward Eunuch Yao at the very front of the crowd. Eunuch Yao had accompanied the emperor through the difficult times on Dong Mountain. After Eunuch Hong sacrificed himself for the country, he had become the foremost figure in the Qing court. However, Fan Xian continued to casually wave his hand as usual. Eunuch Yao bowed and respectfully went forward to listen to the order. From this behavior, no one had any doubt that Fan Xian would have unparalleled power in the future. Fan Xian quietly said something by Eunuch Yao's ear. Eunuch Yao's expression was slightly suspicious. He didn't dare to question Fan Xian's orders. At this moment, he was unable to ask the emperor in the Eastern Palace. After some thought, he led the group of people outside the Eastern Palace to the outskirts, maintaining a long distance from the Eastern Palace. Fan Xian followed them to the side of the little forest in the palace. Looking at the quiet Eastern Palace from a distance, he guessed what the emperor and crown prince were talking about. Having the people in the palace retreat further was actually for safety's sake. He didn't know if the emperor would say something he would never want others to know once he became angry. This was also for his own consideration. Only a few people in the world knew the true reason the emperor wanted to depose the crown prince. This matter had been single-handedly woven by him. The emperor knew of his cultivation. If he stood guard outside the Eastern Palace and heard the dark secrets in the palace, no one would be happy. Fan Xian pressed his dry lips together and looked at the Eastern Palace with eyes full of worry. He thought that Chengxian was soft on the outside, but hard on the inside. He was probably going to walk the same path as the second prince. Thinking about it carefully, he was actually a rather complicated person. The person who had forced the crown prince into a dead end was him. However, who would have thought that the situation would develop like this? The things he and Qin Pingping had done in secret seemed to be driving wolves to scare tigers. Unexpectedly, in the end, they had shaken out a true dragon. During these years, everyone by the emperor's side had either passively or actively stood against the emperor. Qin Pingping and Fan Xian finally succeeded in turning the emperor into a loner. Although he was loner and widowed, he was still at the top of the world. Furthermore, once his aura was released, it was as if he could swallow the sun and moon. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. The situation in the Eastern Palace was not what Fan Xian had guessed. The emperor and the crown prince did not sink into some hysterical family drama quarrel because of the first few words. In a real royal family, there would never be someone as excited as Ma Jingtao. There was only coldness, gloominess, calmness, and cruelty. The emperor sat casually on the stone steps with his legs wide apart. Looking at the door of the Eastern Palace, he thought of many years ago when he waited outside the palace door for the good news of the empress giving birth. That day, there was a joyous atmosphere in the imperial palace. The empress dowager was exceptionally happy, but her own mood was also somewhat solemn. Only when the woman outside the palace, who was also pregnant, sent a letter did he become happy. He knew that the other party was indeed not an ordinary woman. She did not care about the dragon throne at all, nor did she think about seeking the seemingly alluring throne for the child in her belly. It was this attitude that made the emperor a little unhappy. After 20 years, this kind of unhappiness had long become a fading emotion. Occasionally, when he was in the little building in the rear palace and looked at the yellow-clothed woman in the painting, he couldn't resist grumbling. "And Ji is your child, but is he not my child?" It had been 20 years. The child who was destined to become the successor to the throne of the Qin kingdom had grown up and was sitting by his side. His long hair fell softly behind his back. There was only calm and resignation between his brows. The child in the womb of the woman outside the Eastern Palace was now outside the Eastern Palace, standing in some corner and watching the movements in the Eastern Palace. The emperor unconsciously took the teacup the crown prince had drunk from the clean table in front of the steps and brought it to his lips to take a sip. He didn't know whether it was hot or cold. In the end, the Qin kingdom has not been founded for long. For some reason, the emperor chose to speak from here. Slowly, he said, "Although Northern Qi is only the second generation, it inherited the throne of the Wei kingdom. Its internal structure is much more stable. A dozen years ago, the Northern Qi emperor suddenly died. The empress was young, and the prince was young. If it had been in the Qin kingdom, I'm afraid that the attempt to force the abdication would have succeeded. Even if Ku He came out, it would not have succeeded." Li Qingqian's gaze landed on his father's hand holding the teacup. The reason it is like this is because the Qin kingdom has always been a country fought from the battlefield. The military is powerful, and we are used to using knives and swords to reason. Things like etiquette and the might of an emperor are not very convincing. The emperor's gaze was somewhat indifferent. Thus, to be the ruler of the Qing kingdom, one cannot be blindly benevolent. One must have iron methods and a tenacious nature. He turned his head to look at his son and said, "You grew up in the palace. When you were only 8, you already had the name of benevolence." Speaking of this, a glimmer of mockery appeared at the corners of the emperor's lips. "You just helped wrap the feet of a few injured rabbits, and those servants blindly tried to win mother's favor, saying that you would certainly be a benevolent ruler in the future. Blindly benevolent is cowardice. The Qing kingdom will unify the world. For 50 years, there will be endless strife. The old royal families everywhere will not be satisfied. I'm only half a century old, but I have to lay down a foundation that will last for tens of thousands of years. I only had time to conquer this country. Guarding it requires you." The emperor pulled back his gaze and said, "A benevolent ruler and a cowardly ruler. How can you guard this vast land?" Li Chengxian glanced at his father. A self-mocking smile appeared at the corners of his lips. Only now did he understand that his father had been thinking about things decades later, over a decade ago. He had the confidence to unify the world, but he had to think about how the country would continue after 100 years. "That is why I brought Qingze out to fight with you." The emperor closed his eyes and slowly said, "Now that I think about it, at that time, you two were still young. I seem to have been a bit too hasty." Li Chengxian still did not open his mouth to reply. "I had wanted to see if Chengze, that child, would have any future prospects. However, in less than a year, I saw that his thoughts were too fake. As an emperor, he should have an awe-inspiring aura, but he did not." The emperor's eyes remained closed as if he was narrating a distant story. "Thus, I was determined to pass the country to you. However, in those years, your behavior truly disappointed me. You lingered around the flower houses and indulged in sensual pleasures every night, turning your body into something unrecognizable." Li Chengxian smiled self-mockingly and finally slowly opened his mouth. "Father, at that time, I was only 14 or 15. I was just beginning to understand the ways of the world. I wholeheartedly thought that you were going to depose me. I was terrified every night, so I could only find some feeling in a pile of cosmetics." Strangely, the emperor did not get angry after hearing these words. On the contrary, he smiled slightly and said, "Chengze was too restless, but he was clever. He finally saw clearly what I was thinking in my heart. However, he had already come out, so he could only continue walking. From this aspect, your second brother can be said to understand my heart deeply. Perhaps a knife can be ground until it breaks, but if it is not ground, it will never be sharp." The emperor opened his eyes and gazed calmly at his son. "The second prince didn't sharpen you. On the contrary, he ground you dull." Coincidentally, in Ji entered Jingdo, Li Chengxian smiled and thought of the first time he saw Fan Xian outside the courtyard. At that time, as the crown prince, he had never thought much of this assistant minister's son. Who would have thought that this assistant minister's son would, in the end, become his brother and become the hardest whetstone in his training for the inheritance of imperial power? "You've improved a lot these 2 years." The emperor sighed and slowly said, "I don't know if it's because you've matured at your age or if Yunrui has taught you many things, but everyone in court has acknowledged your identity as the crown prince. Your performance has also satisfied me." Hearing the words, Yunrui, the corner of Li Chengxian's mouth twitched involuntarily. Immediately after, he let go of his heart and smiled slightly with great courage. "You let me follow my aunt to learn political affairs." Naturally, there was some effect. The emperor did not get angry. He only lightly said, "It is enough for the so-called political affairs to be taught to you by the scholars Shu and Hu. In reality, you also know that what I had you follow Yunrui to learn is the art of scheming. Looking around the world, you won't be able to find many better teachers than Yunrui." "How good it would be to continue like this," the emperor said quietly. "There are still many things that cannot be learned. When I am old, you should have seen many things. In the end, the heart of an emperor should also be refined. Only then will I be at ease to pass this kingdom to you. Li Chengqian's mood was a bit strange. Although he had been the crown prince since he was young, his father had always been too strict with him and lacked warmth. Thus, he had developed his timid personality. Although his personality had changed a lot these 2 years, it seemed to be the first time he had sat with his father like this and talked to each other. "And Ji has told me everything about the situation in Jingdo," the emperor said warmly. "Your performance was not bad. You behaved appropriately during the rebellion. However, there are a few problems." For the last time, Li Chengqian, as the crown prince, knelt by the emperor's side and bowed to ask for advice. There is no need for any warmth or fear in the struggle for power in the world. He Zhongwei led the imperial censor to defy orders in court, so you should have been beaten to death. The emperor's gaze was incomparably cold, and Ji convinced the civil officials in court to challenge you during the ascension ceremony. You should have killed him. He looked at his son as if teaching him for the last time. As long as someone is in the way, just kill them. On this point, you're not as good as in Ji. The emperor continued, "You didn't kill the 2 scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and those civil officials, and only lock them up. What use was that? This is the biggest mistake you made in the Jingdo matter. If Yunrui had personally handled this matter and not you and mother discussing it, perhaps Jingdo would have long been stabilized and the court would have been cleansed of blood. Fan Xian would not have had the time to act." Li Chengqian smiled bitterly and let out a long sigh. Gazing at his father, he quietly said, "Father, do you know why I couldn't bear to kill those officials?" Without waiting for the emperor to speak, Li Chengqian faintly said, "Perhaps you have forgotten. At the beginning of your intention to depose the heir, it was these old officials who bravely stood out to oppose your edict and stand behind me to support me. Perhaps I am not a very powerful person, but I am someone who knows how to repay favors. Although the scholars who in Shu supported me for the sake of the country, I truly could not bear to act against them." The emperor was silent. No one knew what he was thinking. A moment later, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "When I decided to depose you, there were still people who helped you redeem it." Li Chengqian was startled. Immediately, an image rose in his mind. On the road to Nanzhao, the green banner that had been following the diplomatic group faintly rose. He asked in surprise, "Fan Xian?" He knew 13th Wang was Fan Xian's person, but he didn't know why Fan Xian had done this. It was not until the emperor pointed it out now that he couldn't help but feel complicated emotions surge through his heart. He didn't know that the private matter between him and the eldest princess had been single-handedly destroyed by Fan Xian. He mulled it over in his heart, and then thought of how Fan Xian had prepared to have him escape the royal palace at the beginning of the defeat. For a moment, he couldn't help being startled. The emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "Ji is a real person. Just like you, he occasionally has his true nature. I'm not as good as him." After a moment of silence, the crown prince let out a long sigh. He then stood and kowtowed very seriously to the emperor. Solemnly, he said, "Father, I have always harbored resentment toward you. To be able to hear Father's instructions today, my heart feels much better. However, before I leave, I have something to say. Enough people in my family have died. Please, Father, be more lenient toward those who are still alive." Lenient meant that the emperor's methods in the past had been too harsh. The emperor's expression immediately became grave and stern. Hearing the words before leaving, for some reason, the emperor did not get angry. On the contrary, he looked at Li Chengqian with a complicated gaze. Slowly, he said, "I promise you." A gust of early autumn night wind poured in from the north of the royal palace and whistled along the corridors and gardens inside the palace. It added a sense of melancholy. Live on. I can pretend some things have never happened. The emperor opened his mouth and said something that surprised Li Chengqian. A wretched smile rose to Li Chengqian's face. He knew what kind of person his father was. The emperor valued the heart. Since he had rebelled once, he would never be able to obtain the emperor's trust again. Furthermore, the matter between him and his aunt had already touched the emperor's sore spot. Although no one knew why this was a sore spot, Li Chengxian would not accept a lifetime of house arrest. As a man of the Li family, he always had the courage to kill himself. His gaze became calm. Looking at the emperor, he quietly said, "What is the point in saying such things now? I asked earlier, how exactly will this be recorded in the history books? Presently, we are rebellious officials and unfilial sons. Everyone has the right to punish us. We colluded with foreign enemies and brought chaos to the palace. You are a dazzling ruler. You have done nothing wrong. Everything wrong is someone else's." The emperor's expression had already recovered its calm. Quietly, he listened to Li Chengqian's indifferent tone and bone-piercing words. "You seem to have forgotten something. No matter how the history books erase it, you have to remember how many people died in Jingdou in the early autumn of the 7th year of the Qin calendar. The Li family lost a grandmother, an empress, an eldest princess, a crown prince, and a prince." Li Chengqian sighed. For the first time, he used an equal and even superior gaze to look at his undefeatable father. "You will be an emperor in the history books. Yet by your side it is so clean that there is not a single person. Will you not be lonely?" The emperor looked at him coldly and didn't say anything. There was a slight smile at the corners of his lips. It was as if to say that as a god above the 9 heavens, how could he care about the loneliness at the top of the clouds or the liveliness of the mortal world? Then he stood up and walked out of the Eastern Palace. When he reached the palace doors, his heart jumped. He took out a letter from his sleeve. This was the second prince's will. Earlier, Gong Jian had given it to him. The emperor took out the thin piece of paper to see just what his second son wanted to tell him before he died. There were 2 lines of incomparably messy words on the paper. The brush strokes were dried up. It was clear that it had been written in a hurry. However, the turns were powerful. Like a knife or sword piercing the back of the paper, it was filled with anger and dissatisfaction. The third prince, Li Qingze, the first whetstone the Qing emperor had thrown to the court, shouted something similar to the crown prince's in his last will to his lofty father. However, the words he used were more bone-piercing and cutting, particularly the last 4 words. Widowed, widowed, lonely, lonely, old and without a wife was widowed. Ruling over the world without anyone close to him was widowed. Losing one's mother was lonely. Old and without a son was lonely. In the battle that stretched from Dong Mountain to Jingdou, the Qing emperor had defeated 2 great grandmasters in a row. He had lured out and purged the restless elements in the royal family and military, and picked out the sinister traitors in court. In one move, he had established the great achievement of unifying the world. This grand situation that had been constructed for decades had become reality. Without question, it was the most glorious time of the Qing emperor's life. However, the empress was dead. The woman for back then had long died. The empress dowager had died. The eldest princess, who had accompanied the emperor for 20 years and sacrificed her youth for him, had also died. The crown prince had died. The second prince had died. Everyone had died. Only the emperor was left, a lonely and desolate man. The Qing emperor looked coldly at the letter. His fingers trembled slightly. With a rustling sound, the letter turned into a pile of white powder and slid down between his fingers. Blown by the autumn wind outside the Eastern Palace, it scattered in all directions like a bleak snowfall. A glimmer of pain flashed through his eyes. His brows were furrowed tightly. The words his 2 sons said before they died pierced deeply into this ruler's heart. The white hair on the middle-aged man's temples grew darker. His gaze gradually dimmed. There seemed to be wetness at the corners of his eyes. However, his body remained straight and strong, unmoving. The doors of the Eastern Palace once again closed tightly. No one knew what had happened inside. Everyone knew that the dethroned crown prince, Li Chengxian, would certainly spend his last moments in this cold and cheerless palace. However, at some point, the royal palace's bell rang out again. Perhaps it was disdainful. It only coldly and emotionlessly watched his death. The emperor sent away all of the servants, leaving only Fan Xian to accompany him. Silently, he walked deep into the rear palace. Along the way, he passed the Chun corridor, the cold palace, and the overgrown weeds. Once again, he came to the little building that no one had come to for a long time. The father and son did not go up the building or look at the portrait in it. The emperor only glanced silently at the little building a few times. He then resolutely turned and left, following the path of autumn grass toward a place where no one was around. Fan Xian silently followed 3 steps behind him. There was a heaviness in the depths of his heart. There was no need to disguise it. It was truly heavy. Faintly, he could guess the emperor's current feelings. So many of his family members had died one after another. Although these family members were enemies he had to eliminate, no one could escape the ties of flesh and blood. The emperor was like a god, but he was still a mortal person. The Grand Supreme could forget emotions, but if he truly was the Grand Supreme, why struggle and struggle in this secular world? The successive deaths made even Fan Xian's emotion suppressed, much less the emperor. No matter what was said, this tired-looking middle-aged man was, in the end, a father, an elder brother, a husband, and a son. The 2 of them stood in the weeds up to their knees and maintained a tacit silence, looking at the quiet royal palace in the night. The emperor did not speak. Fan Xian was even more afraid to speak. He only carefully watched the expression on his profile. The emperor was silent for a long time and still did not speak. He had many things he wanted to say to someone, but Fan Xian was only his son. Let's return to the palace. Yes, Fan Xian replied. His expression was heavy. The emperor turned his head and happened to see this expression. His heart darkened slightly. His feelings toward his son grew increasingly better. Additionally, the crown prince's words earlier involuntarily made the emperor sink into deep thought again. After thinking for a moment, the emperor waved his hand weakly and said, "If you are still not feeling well, come into the palace and ask me." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what these words meant. Just as he was about to say something, he found that the emperor had already turned and left. Returning to the royal study and eating some supper, the emperor felt a bit tired. Fan Xian wanted to leave the palace, but was stopped by the emperor. It seemed that he desperately needed someone to accompany him. After a while, Eunuch Yao came in and quietly said something. The emperor nodded and had Fan Xian return to his manor to rest. He would enter the palace to discuss matters the next day. Fan Xian accepted the order and left. In a long corridor outside the royal study, he heard a familiar sound. It was the sound of a wheelchair rolling on the ground. He knew the emperor was watching him from behind. In the dim light of the royal study, his expression was warm. He bowed deeply to the old man in the wheelchair and said, "You're here." Chen Pingping had finally returned to Jingdou, to the royal palace, and to the emperor's side. Just when the emperor was at his loneliest and most needed, the royal study was silent. There was silence in the royal study. The emperor looked at his most loyal official, his closest friend, and his most reliable comrade. He closed his eyes and said, "I have forced these sons too hard. Writing these chapters is mentally and emotionally tiring. In the end, I did not make the emperor shed tears. Crocodile tears cannot move people. Sometimes it is just a kind of self-pity and self-comfort. However, I truly admire people like the Qing emperor. From a certain point of view, he is the same as Yi Qingmei. They are both idealists. However, idealists do not necessarily bring about ideal results for the world. I am a profiteer, so I can only keep a respectful distance from these kinds of people. Thus, I am very serious about getting monthly votes and fighting to be in the top 3 because of the 6,000 yuan bonus. Chapter 588. It's been a long time since I wrote this. Little cotton-padded jacket refers to true love for each other. I hope everyone likes this chapter. What Qin Pingping, sitting in the wheelchair, and the emperor, sitting on the throne, talked about that night would remain a mystery until many years later. No one had the right to listen. Even Eunuch Yao, who never left the emperor's side, was the same. This conversation was actually similar to the 2 conversations outside the royal study within a year. The words came from the emperor's lips, entered the official's ears, and did not pass to a third person. However, the present Jingdo had long known that the events of the past few months had all been secretly planned by the Emperor and Director Chun. The two of them were only waiting for the enemy hidden in the dark to jump out and then capture them all in one fell swoop. The Qing Emperor and Director Chun working together was truly too powerful. They were able to keep the entire Jingdo in the dark for half a month. Only now did people remember that many years ago, Director Chun had accompanied the Emperor in his great undertaking of unifying the world. The old man in the wheelchair had saved the Emperor a few times, and the Emperor had also given him the greatest trust and honor. The older generation had never doubted Chun Pingping's loyalty to the Emperor. This was a fact that had long been proven by history. It was only now that it was once again reflected. There were many speculations in the hearts of the people in Jingdo regarding this conversation. That night, when Fan Xian left the royal palace and hurried toward his manor, he did not pay attention to the conversation in the royal study. He also did not think that this conversation would have anything to do with him. He guessed that the Emperor was just a bit lonely, while Qin Pingping was playing the role of a loyal official and temporary friend. The reality was not far from his guess. From a certain point of view, Fan Xian and his old emperor were truly similar. If the Qing Emperor was the best actor in the world, hiding it from the world for 20 years, then Fan Xian was the second best actor, hiding his thoughts in his heart and hiding it from the Qing Emperor. This was an unprecedented battle of acting skills. It was a battle of the heart. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and stared in a daze at the silent and uneasy Jingdo night streets. He thought gloomily that he had obtained the Emperor's absolute trust. He had won another battle in this battle, but why fight? How would he fight in the future? The worry and anxiety on his face were not faked, but came from the depths of his heart. Especially the complicated joy, worry, and bewilderment between his brows completely expressed his current mood. Brushing past the wheelchair, Fan Xian lowered his head in greeting. He saw the glimmer of warmth and congratulations in Chun Pingping's old eyes. He immediately understood that Cece had indeed been taken away by the director. Since he had already returned to the capital, Cece had also returned to the manor. However, he didn't know if she had given birth or if it was a boy or a girl. Thinking of this, how could he still be in the mood to think about the conversation in the royal study? His entire heart had already returned to Fan Manor. He urged his subordinates to whip the horses pulling the carriage. However, too many people had died these few days. Even though he knew that he might have become a father, Fan Xian only felt a faint satisfaction and not too much ecstasy. One was grieving the death of her birth mother in the manor. After she returned to the manor, she didn't know how to deal with it. The carriage did not stop at the front gate of Fan Manor. Instead, it went straight in through a side alley and stopped at the corner gate left specially for the back garden. Without waiting for the carriage to come to a complete stop, Fan Xian had already jumped down from the carriage. Smiling, he glanced at the wife of the Tung family, who was welcoming him happily at the gate. He then walked toward his own manor. After a few steps, his smile disappeared. It was not that he was purposely putting on an act. It was truly because the arrival of a new life could not wash away the smell of blood brought by so many deaths in Jingdo. Walking past the flower hall and into the east wing, he was not surprised to find that the lights were still slightly lit. His father and Lady Lu were waiting for him in the room. The dim light shone on Minister Fan's face, illuminating his wrinkles and the joy in them. Minister Fan was looking at a baby in Lady Lu's arms. Although he managed to maintain the appearance of a stern master, he could not hide the joy in his eyes. When Fan Xian entered, he first bowed to his father and Lady Lu. He did not glance at the baby in Lady Lu's arms. Instead, he turned his gaze directly to the side of the bed. He saw a sitting by the bed, holding Cece's hand and quietly saying something. Wan'er's eyes were red and swollen like pink peaches. She appeared very pitiful. Her face had also become much thinner and looked haggard. However, she forced a smile and chatted idly with Cece, who was lying on the bed. After Fan Xian paused slightly, he walked over. Not caring that the two elders were in the room, he sat directly by Wan'er's side. With a face full of smiles, he looked at Cece, who was leaning against the pillow. He looked at the girl of the past and said, "You're already a mother. Why aren't you sleeping so late?" Although Cece had been frightened during the month she was about to give birth, she had the protection of the Overwatch Council. She had been taken to travel around Jingdo by Old Chun and had never been exposed to a cold. She had exercised more than a normal pregnant woman, so she looked more energetic than a normal pregnant woman. In addition, this girl had grown up with Fan Xian and had been influenced to be free and at ease. She had a broad mind and did not become haggard because of the birth of the baby. On the contrary, her face had a bit more plumpness. She looked more like a lovely young woman. "Young master, you sleep all day. How can you sleep?" Cece was still used to calling him young master. Her brows were full of joy and the pride of being a mother for the first time. However, she forcefully restrained her words. Although her personality was relaxed, she was not a heartless idiot. She knew that too many things had happened in the capital. The young mistress's heart was filled with grief. She did not want to display too much at a time like this. However, after the young master entered the room, he did not even look at the baby in Lady Lu's arms and came to the side of the bed. Cece began to ponder in her heart. Could it be that she had given birth to a daughter and the young master was not happy? Her eyes dimmed a little. Even though Fan Xian was clever, he was still unclear about the thoughts of the women in the back of the manor. Looking at the girl's expression, he thought she was sad because she had no one to accompany her during childbirth. He smiled and prepared to open his mouth to comfort her. He didn't understand, but Lin Wan would understand, and Lady Lu would also understand. Seeing Lady Lu carrying the baby over to the bed, Wanner smiled and gave Fan Xian a look. Quietly, she said, "Go look at the girl." Fan Xian was startled. He turned his head and saw Lady Lu looking at him with a slightly reproachful expression. Only then did he understand where the problem was. He smiled bitterly and took the baby from Lady Lu's arms. Carefully holding in his hands, he looked at it and found that the baby in the swaddling clothes, the little baby girl, was not good-looking. Not only was she not as good-looking as Fan Xian, she was also not as good-looking as Cece's big eyes. As he looked at her, he couldn't help but laugh. He felt that he was being a bit silly. A newborn baby naturally could not be said to be good-looking. As long as it was healthy, it was fine. Lady Lu and the other 3 women saw him carelessly take the baby and were startled. They did not react and looked at him nervously, afraid that he did not know how to hold the baby. Lady Lu was about to reach out and snatch the baby back, but she did not expect Fan Xian to bend his left elbow slightly and support his neck with his arm. His right hand lightly clapped. Seeing this, everyone let out a sigh of relief, including Minister Fan. They all looked at Fan Xian in surprise. Wanner, who had been depressed for a long time, could not help but secretly laugh. At this moment, Fan Xian only cared about looking at his daughter. How could he care about how others looked at him? He did not think that in this world, there were very few men who were willing to hold a child, especially in a rich family like theirs. Furthermore, he was so familiar with it, like he was an old nanny. Everyone was stunned. Fan Xian held the baby and spoke gently to Cece. "The situation has been unstable lately, and it has been hard on you. But you know me. It is not that I do not look at the child when I enter the house because I do not like my daughter. It is just that in my eyes, children are not as important as adults. Your safety is the most important thing." Having been secretly reprimanded by Lady Lu and Wanner, Fan Xian naturally knew why Cece had been sad. He smiled and explained a little. He did not take it to heart, but he did not think that when his words fell into Wanner and Cece's hearts, they each had different feelings. Cece's heart was filled with sweetness. She thought about when she was young and how her young master had always muttered that giving birth was the hardest for a mother, and that giving birth to a boy or a girl was the same. Although she felt sweetness in her heart, she did not dare to show it too much in front of Wanner. She knew that the young mistress had always been very kind to her. Furthermore, these 2 years, she had wholeheartedly wanted a child, but she had always, thinking of this, Cece missed the last 2 sentences of Fan Xian's words. She carefully glanced at the young mistress, who still had her head lowered and was smiling warmly. For some reason, Her heart ached, and she felt sad for the young mistress. The women's thoughts were complicated, but Fan Xian held his daughter and looked closely at her. The more he looked, the more he liked her. When he had entered the room earlier, he had only cared about Cece's body and Wan Er's emotions. He had not thought much of his daughter. Now that he held her and felt the softness of this little body through the cloth, he looked at the wrinkles on his daughter's forehead and watched his daughter occasionally purse her lips. His heart grew softer and softer. This was the biggest difference between men and women. A woman had been pregnant for 10 months before giving birth to a child. They had already nurtured feelings for the child for 10 months. In addition, they had put in a lot of hard work and pain. Naturally, they had a strong, indescribable warmth toward their child. A man's feelings, on the other hand, needed to be watched, held, and experienced before they would grow stronger. Particularly for someone as busy as Fan Xian, he had not been by Cece's side when she was pregnant, so he did not have strong feelings for this child. However, as he held her, the feeling came. Fan Xian held her more and more carefully. He stared in a daze at the little girl in his arms and thought, was this my daughter? In the future, she would definitely be very beautiful. In the future, she would definitely be very shrewd. In the future, these tightly shut little eyes would also grow bigger and bigger, becoming more and more beautiful. After his heart softened, it gradually became sour and sweet. For some reason, Fan Xian felt his nose was a bit stuffy. This kind of feeling was too complicated. Even he didn't know what words to use to describe it. He only knew one thing. His 2 lives, which had been filled with calamities and great luck, had finally been extended in this world. In this moment, he thought that even if he died on the spot, he would have left something in this world. It was different from looking at the rows of books in the Jingdo government's Yin Sun family. This kind of feeling was stronger, more alive, and more strangely moving. After holding for a while, Wan Er, who was watching from the side, took the child under Lady Lu's guidance and Fan Xian's demonstration. She held the child in her arms with heartache. According to the rules of this world, this was still her child. This kind of heartache was real. Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked at the pity and glimmer of curiosity in his wife's eyes. Only then did he remember that his wife was not very old. Under his care, she was not much different from a young girl. However, seeing Wan Er holding the child, it seemed that some of the pain in his heart had lessened slightly. He felt much better. It was already late at night. Everyone was a bit tired. However, this was the first life in the 3rd generation of the Fan Manor. Everyone was excited. Even Minister Fan did not shy away from staying in the room. He happily watched this scene and refused to rest. In the end, it was Lady Lu who said a few words and had the old nanny and wet nurse, who had been waiting outside, come in. Holding the child, she stood to the side and urged everyone to rest early. As Minister Fan was leaving, he suddenly thought of something. He prepared to call Fan Xian to the study to ask about the situation in the palace and the emperor's mood. Immediately after, he remembered that the child had been mentally and physically exhausted these days. With great difficulty, there was a joyous occasion. Why disturb him? So, he didn't open his mouth. On the contrary, when the 2 elders left, Fan Xian happily asked, "Father, when I was in Jiangnan, I asked you to name her. What name did you give this girl?" He asked happily, but Minister Fan glanced at Lady Lu with a complicated gaze. Shortly after, he calmly said, "As a girl, there is no rush in choosing a name. First, you could just call her by a nickname." Fan Xiaohua. Fan Xian smiled and said, "You've thought a nickname a long time ago." After these words were said, Lin Wan Er and Cece were both dissatisfied. They wondered how someone of their status could have such a common name. However, Cece didn't dare open her mouth in front of everyone. Wan noticed the old man's expression. Her heart jumped, but she didn't say anything. Fan Xian and Wan met each other's eyes. Only then did they remember something. Their expressions did not look good. After Minister Fan and Lady Lu left, he couldn't resist shaking his head and sighing. Looking at his daughter in the old nanny's arms, he said, "Will this girl's name also have to wait for the palace to bestow it?" Hearing this, Cece jumped in fright. What kind of explanation was this? Immediately after, she thought of the young master's other identity and quickly pressed her lips together, not daring to express any opinion. Linhua gazed at him and quietly said, I heard the old master say that back then, your name was also given by the palace. I think it's not just a name. At the latest, the emperor will have you bring the child into the palace the day after tomorrow. Bestowing a name is a matter. The palace will probably send a group of old nannies and wet nurses for you to choose. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and smiled coldly. Those old bastards in the palace, if they come, then they come. I'll just raise them alone. Now, he had the confidence to speak. He was someone who dared to slap even the Empress Dowager, let alone those old fish eyeballs. However, after these words were said, the nanny in the east wing holding the baby girl became afraid. The wet nurse behind her lowered her head and didn't dare to breathe too loudly. Fan Xian glanced at them and calmly said, I'll have to trouble you to take good care of the young lady, but there's no need for a wet nurse. Tomorrow, the mistress will speak with the mistress. Linhua glanced at him with confusion. What was her husband doing? Why was he kicking out the wet nurse? She watched as Fan Xian sat back down on the bed. Smiling, he asked Cece, Is there milk? Cece blushed slightly and nodded. Fan Xian smiled and said, Then it's settled. The child has to be raised by herself. What's the point of having a wet nurse nurse the child? Fan Xian thought, how do you people know the importance of breastfeeding? How much does colostrum sell for in the world? The doctor had said that the psychological effects of a mother breastfeeding a baby. He knew that no one in the world would understand these things if he told them. So he didn't discuss it with the two women and made his decision. The wet nurse to the side lowered her head and didn't dare to say anything. She thought to herself, what's wrong with a wet nurse? The reason the Fan family was able to prosper was because the ancestors in Danzhou had nurtured a few children of the royal family. The old nanny heard something else and looked at the young master, dumbfounded. Was the young master going to let his aunt raise the young lady herself? That was against the rules. Tomorrow, she would have to talk to the master and mistress about it. Fan Xian didn't know what the old woman was thinking, but he didn't care. He had worked hard in this world for 20 years. If he had to let others talk about how he raised his own daughter, then he would have lived his life in vain. He sat by Cece's side and said a few more words. He found that the girl was sleepy and forcing her eyes to stay open to talk. He couldn't bear it, so he smiled and said, Hurry up and go to sleep. In the past, when we were in Danzhou, you were even lazier than me. Seeing Cece's hesitant expression, Fan Xian smiled and said, You've been in the capital for a few years, and you've become muddle-headed. When you were little, I said that giving birth to a boy or a girl is the same. Although it's not a national policy, it's a family rule. When they returned to the master bedroom, a servant girl who had been rubbing her sleepy eyes brought hot water and prepared to serve the two masters to bed. Fan Xian waved his hand and shooed them out. He helped one sit on the side of the bed and looked seriously into her eyes. He said, I know the rules of the manor. The children of the mistress have to live with the first branch. Tears swirled in Linhua's eyes, but they didn't fall. These few days, she had suffered many blows. There was a lot of sorrow in her heart, but she had nowhere to pour it out. Cece had returned home today. Although she remembered that the baby girl was Fan Xian's flesh and blood and was happy in her heart and even faintly grateful to Cece, the emotions in her heart were incomparably complicated. In particular, Fan Xian faintly revealed that he didn't want her to participate. After a few mixed emotions, it made one sad uncontrollably. She was of noble birth and had a strange background. Her personality was like ice and snow. Her naivety was mixed with a hidden intelligence. In the end, she was still a woman. Any woman would always have a woman's meticulous thoughts. Fan Xian looked at her calmly. He knew that the eldest princess's death, the second prince's death, and the bloodshed of the royal family had already made it difficult for his wife to bear the burden. Using the softest tone he could muster, he said, You're thinking about it the wrong way, aren't you? I just don't want those nannies to taint our child. This child is still ours, but Cece is her birth mother. We can't just carry her over like this. Linhua sighed and gazed at her husband's face in front of her. In a quiet voice, she said. "You don't have to be so careful in front of me. I know you're worried about me." She forced a smile. "However, sometimes I do feel a bit jealous. Like the things you and Cece sometimes say, I don't really understand. Something about national policy or family rules or something." Fan Xian smiled helplessly. After all, Cece had grown up with him. Just like how he used letters to educate his younger sister, there were some things that belonged to that life. He held his wife's hands and quietly said, "In the future, I'll tell you everything. Only we know. If other people want to know, I won't tell them." He paused and held his wife's hands tightly. Smiling, he said, "I'll tell you everything about carriages, bridal sedan chairs, cars, and cannons." Linwater was confused. She knew about carriages and bridal sedan chairs, but what were cars and cannons? She knew he was trying to coax her, so she forcefully hid the sorrow on her face. Lowering her head slightly, she said, "I actually want a child. Looking at my brother's current situation, I don't know what will happen in the future. With a child, I'll have one more hope." These words were spoken lightly, but it made Fan Xian's heart ache, particularly as he looked at Wan Er's slightly thin face. Compared to 2 years ago, she was much thinner. Compared to Cece on the other side, it was as if she had just given birth and lost her body. He felt even more pity for her. He knew what his wife was thinking. Furthermore, the development of the medicine should be almost complete, so he had a lot of confidence. With a teasing tone, he said, "Of course, we have to have a child. Let's give little a little brother. This house will be lively." Wan only thought he was coaxing her. She smiled and didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at her furtively and said, "However, it seems there are many steps to having a child. Speaking of which, we haven't been intimate in more than half a year." Lin Wan smiled and spat at him. Shortly after, she remembered that her husband was purposely teasing her. Thinking of his kindness and attentiveness, she felt even more sorrow. Fan Xian was only joking. So many people had died in the palace. How could the husband and wife be in the mood to do such things? He stood and brought over the basin of slightly warm water. Placing it in front of the bed, he directly took off Wan Er's shoes and socks, giving her a fright. "I'll wash your feet. Running around in and out of the palace these days, you must have suffered a lot." Fan Xian lowered his head and placed his wife's bare feet into the basin. Stirring up the hot water, he gently rubbed them. Lin Wan looked at his hair and felt the threads of warmth coming from her feet. Her nose ached, and she began to cry soundlessly. Fan Xian lowered his head. Without raising it, he knew she was crying. He knew his wife's pain, but he couldn't find any words to comfort her. He could only silently help her wash her feet. Uncontrollably, there were countless more sorrows in his heart. Chapter 589. Being a father for the first time and finding the long-lost gentleness on his wife's knees, Fan Xian slept peacefully. He didn't wake until late in the morning. In the moment he woke, there was still a satisfied smile at the corners of his lips. Opening his eyes, he found that Wan was no longer by his side. He guessed that she had gone to see her daughter. He couldn't help but rub his head and smile. He thought that now that he was also a father, when he did things and thought about problems, he had to be more appropriate and steady. Thinking like this, he threw the death disputes in Jingdo to the back of his mind. His mood, which had been gloomy for a long time, became a bit more cheerful. However, the sky was bright and urged him to return to the dangerous world. Fan Xian sighed and casually washed up with the help of a serving girl. He put on his official robes and entered the flower hall. He didn't want to eat properly. Carrying a bowl of bird's nest porridge, he entered the east wing and looked at his still sleeping daughter. As he ate, he joked with Wan and Cece. He then went to pay his respects to his father, Lady Lu, and left the manor for the royal palace. The streets of Jingdo were still filled with a somber atmosphere. However, the emperor had returned safely to the capital. The Jingdo people's moods were much more at ease. The number of people on the streets gradually increased. Fan Xian looked at this scene through the window and felt slightly at ease. Passing through the palace doors and along the long corridor, he came to the royal study. As expected, he saw the diligent emperor wearing an unlined robe and reading memorials. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. After bowing, he stood up and waited silently to the side, using his peripheral vision to sneak a look at the emperor's expression. With a glance, he was shocked. He found that the corners of the emperor's lips carried an unfathomable smile. Naturally, it revealed a sense of comfort. It was completely different from the lonely appearance of the father and son of the Tian family yesterday, after they had killed each other. Fan Xian was confused. He thought to himself that he had just given birth to a precious daughter, so he was happy. Where did the emperor's happiness come from? Thinking of this, Fan Xian felt even more admiration for Director Chun, who had been summoned into the palace last night. Probably only that old cripple could make the emperor so happy. It was as if he had forgotten the tragedies that had happened one after another. The emperor put down the memorial and raised his head. Looking at Fan Xian warmly, he said, "There is no court conference today. Why have you come to the palace so early?" Jingdo had just stabilized. The officials of the 6 ministries were either locked up, escaped, injured, or dead. Everything was still under the control of the military. With the imperial army as the main force and the Jingdo government as the base, they maintained the general order of Jingdo. Naturally, there was no way to hold a court conference as usual. Fan Xian felt it was strange. He thought to himself that the situation was so tense. Who knew how many things had to be taken care of in the palace? Even if the emperor wanted to immediately strip him of his position as the regent, as a close official, he had to enter the palace to share the burdens. Did he dare to close his door and live out his days in his manner? He carefully replied, "The rebel army is about to be ambushed, but there are still some uncertainties in various places. I thought about it carefully and was afraid that His Majesty would have some instructions, so I hurried to enter the palace." The emperor smiled and said, "You just gave birth to a girl, yet you don't stay a bit longer in the manor. Could it be that you really have a busy life?" Fan Xian smiled. He knew that it must have been Chun Pingping who had spoken to the emperor last night. He said, "After I'm off duty, I'll just go back to the manor and hug more. You're not an official of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. When did I put you on duty?" The emperor glared at him and said, "You still have to be so careless after giving birth. How is that like a father?" Fan Xian paused. Only now did he understand the emperor's meaning. It looked like he was preparing for him to go home and nurse his child. This was what he had hoped for. Hearing the emperor's harsh words of criticism, he felt a bit depressed in his heart. When it came to being a father, although it was his first time, he thought he would be much better than the emperor. Didn't he see what happened to Cheng Xian and the second prince? Thinking of the 2 brothers, he immediately thought of Cheng Xian waiting for death in the Eastern Palace while he had just given birth to a daughter. The expression on his face began to become strange. His lips moved slightly. He didn't know how to respond to the emperor's words. Perhaps the emperor saw something strange in his expression. His expression also changed slightly, but he did not give any instructions on how to deal with the matter of the rebellion. Lightly, he said, "You don't have to wait in the palace today. Go back first. It's your first day as a father. You have to be careful." Pausing slightly, the emperor suddenly tilted his head as if thinking about something. A moment later, he slowly said, "Tomorrow, have Chun girl bring the child into the palace for me to see." Fan Xian quickly gave his thanks. He could also see that the emperor's mood had become bad again. Receiving the edict, he quickly left the royal study. As soon as he left the royal study, he was stopped by eunuch Yao. He had probably also received news of the Fan Manor's happiness and repeatedly offered his congratulations. Fan Xian didn't have time to chat much with the eunuch. He handed over a red packet, but suddenly thought of something. Lowering his voice, he asked about the captured eunuchs and serving girls in the palace, as well as the aces and guards of the internal court, about how to deal with them. Although the true settling of accounts after autumn should be a matter after the situation was settled, dealing with things in the palace was always much faster than dealing with things outside. Even if they hadn't taken action yet, the emperor should have drawn up some rules. Fan Xian was worried. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he asked the eunuch close to the emperor. Although he was worried in his heart, his face did not show a glimmer of anxiety. He did his best to ask as lightly as possible, pretending to be concerned as a regent should. Eunuch Yao knew this young man's identity and knew his future power. He would not think too much and picked out a few important matters to talk about. Fan Xian had wanted to ask about the situation in the Eastern Palace. After thinking about it carefully, he closed his mouth. After bidding farewell to Eunuch Yao, he was in a daze and couldn't come back to his senses for a moment. What shocked him was that the emperor had dealt with these eunuchs, serving girls, and guards so leniently. It was completely different from what he had guessed. Putting aside Hongzhu, the head of the eunuchs who hadn't done anything on the surface, not many of the nannies in Hongguang Palace, the new eunuchs in the Eastern Palace, and the serving girls in Guangxin Palace had been killed. Most of them had kept their lives. Fan Xian shook his head and walked toward the outside of the palace. He wondered if the sun had risen from the west today. How did the emperor suddenly become such a gentle person? Suddenly, his heart jumped. Thinking of the emperor's dark expression last night and his warm conversation with him earlier, he involuntarily guessed that perhaps the emperor had finally thought through some things after suffering a great shock and was beginning to accumulate good fortune for himself and the descendants of the Li family. The reality was actually not far from his guess. The emperor was not someone who killed indiscriminately or liked to kill. It was just that his personality was firm and harsh, and he did not shy away from killing. For example, the servants in the palace only listened to the Empress Dowager's orders and were not deeply involved in rebellion. Furthermore, the emperor did not care about removing weeds by the roots. Additionally, the crown prince and second prince had used their deaths to show their resistance. This made a slight change in the emperor's mentality. The next day, Fan Xian and Lin Wan'er carried the little girl into the palace. For the first time, the emperor displayed the benevolence an elder should have in front of the two of them. He held the baby girl and looked closely at her for a long time. He was in a good mood. However, when the emperor used his fingers to carefully stroke the baby girl's brows, Fan Xian's heart trembled. In Hongguang Palace, he knew how powerful the emperor's fingers were. However, the emperor seemed to like this girl very much, particularly her brows and eyes. Fan Xian looked at this scene and muttered to himself. He wondered if the emperor was beginning to remember some of the marks from the past again. As he was thinking this, the emperor had him take the child to the various palaces for the concubines to see and left Wan'er behind. Fan Xian was slightly surprised but didn't say anything. He followed the order and left. Presently, there was no mistress in the palace. Naturally, the reward for sending off the child could not be immediately explained. It was left to be dealt with in the future. When Lady Ning carried the child, she said she wanted the palace to send a nanny and wet nurse. However, Fan Xian firmly refused. This made Lady Ning and Yi Guipin a bit puzzled. This was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but too many people had died in the palace recently, so it was impossible to be happy. No matter how loud Lady Ning's laughter was, it could not dilute the strange atmosphere in the palace. Yi Guipin only smiled warmly. It was the third prince, Li Changping, who had not yet recovered from his injuries, who struggled to be carried and called her little sister. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly. He thought to himself that this kid was indeed terrifyingly precocious. However, this seniority seemed to be ridiculously wrong. For some reason, he thought of his sister and Xia far away in northern Qi. The Dong Mountain matter involved 3 countries. He was certain to die. He didn't know if the two of them would have any problems over there. He didn't stay for long before Fan Xian withdrew with the child in his arms. He went into the royal study to pick up his wife and bid farewell to the emperor to return home. The emperor thought for a moment and then allowed it. He also said that the matter of bestowing names could be discussed later. Fan Xian knew that the emperor had been busy dealing with court affairs after the rebellion. He had not thought that he would still remember such a small matter. He couldn't help but be surprised. After leaving the palace, Fan Xian didn't ask Wan'er what the emperor had kept her to say. Looking at his wife's red and swollen eyes, he knew that the conversation between his uncle and niece this time was without a doubt related to the deaths of the eldest princess and those two. In the following month, under the emperor's powerful efforts, the 6 ministries, three departments of the court gradually returned to the right track. The remnants of the rebel army scattered in the wilderness were also completely wiped out. Yi Zhong led the troops back in triumph. The entire situation had stabilized. Jingdou returned to peace. The aura of the rebellion finally gradually faded. Fan Xian resigned from his position as regent early in the morning. On the night the royal entourage returned to the capital, he returned the emperor's royal seal. Although he didn't resign and no one saw him as regent anymore, no one knew whether or not these minor mistakes would lead to a major disaster in the future. Each day he was late was one more day of danger. He continued to be the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and the transport envoy of the palace treasury. He no longer had to worry about the problems in court affairs. The court affairs were managed by the two scholars and a group of civil officials. The military was managed by the Bureau of Military Affairs. None of them had anything to do with him. Thus, other than Yin Bingyun occasionally coming to the manor to report on an errand and Jiangnan's Su Wenmao and Xia Qifei's timely delivery of council reports, there was nothing else for him to worry about. However, there were some interludes, such as how Sir Yin Jr. had survived. Fan Xian did not ask a single word. He didn't even want to go to the Overwatch Council, much less ask those annoying questions. On the contrary, it was Xia Qifei's letter that the old Ming master in Jiangnan had hanged himself after learning of the eldest princess' defeat. This made Fan Xian sigh with emotion. Ming Qingda had finally died. Thinking of how he had fought with this old man for a long time in Jiangnan and had not expected him to die like this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel perplexed. He thought to himself that when the old man hung himself, perhaps he had used the white cloth he had given him. Perhaps it was because he had been tired by the string of matters in Jingdou. Or perhaps it was because his old injuries had lingered, but Fan Xian was truly ill. After he recovered, he only stayed at home to hold his child, comfort his wife, and be filial to his old man. He hid in the little building and did not care about the north, south, east, and west winds outside. He enjoyed his family and was very happy. Jingdou gradually calmed down. After the surviving officials had settled their thoughts, they began to return to their usual days of currying favor. Everyone knew that during this month, Sir Fan Jr., who had done the most in quelling the rebellion, rarely entered the palace. He only stayed at home with his child. They couldn't help but feel confused. Some people who thought they were clever thought the emperor had other thoughts. Later, news gradually came from the palace. It was said that the emperor greatly liked Sir Fan Jr.'s little girl. Even allowing Sir Fan Jr. to rest for a month was the emperor's grace. Thus, everyone knew what they had to do. The Empress Dowager had just passed away, and all of Jingdou had turned white. In accordance with etiquette, all entertainment and pastimes had been stopped, and the restaurants had to be closed for a month. The Fan Manor had a joyous occasion, so they could not make a big fuss. They didn't even hang a single red lantern outside the door. No matter how one looked at it, one could not see the joyous atmosphere. Every day at dusk, there would always be some officials sneaking into the Fan Manor, leaving behind gifts and leaving without a word. The Fan father and son quietly accepted the gifts. As for the matters the officials had entrusted them with, they couldn't be bothered to pay attention to them. They knew why, in such a serious and tense time, those officials still took the risk to send gifts and use connections. After putting down the rebellion, a large number of the officials who usually followed the crown prince, the second prince, and the eldest princess had been taken down and locked up in the Overwatch Council's prison. Some of the officials who did not have a firm enough stance in the Jingdou matter had been chased out of the yamen by the emperor with a stroke of his pen. In all of the 6 ministries, including Dongshan Road and Jiangnan Road in the east, there were suddenly hundreds of empty spots. Cats loved fish, dogs loved poop, and officials loved positions. These hundreds of positions made their eyes red. How could they care too much? There had been too many changes in the palace. Many of the old connections had been cut off. Most of the people had no connection to the Dingzhou army, so no one dared to give gifts to the cold-faced great prince. Coincidentally, Sir Fan Jr. had given birth to a daughter, giving them a great opportunity to give gifts. They could not pass it up. After a month, Jingdo was finally settled. The Hall of Governmental Affairs drew up a list of the vacated positions in the various ministries, temples, and courtyards, as well as the east and south roads. They filled in many of the candidates from the spring examinations. Most of them could be considered good and capable people. The officials whose names were written were overjoyed. They thought it was the gifts they had given to the fan manor that had worked. Those who were not chosen were secretly angry. The silver they had prepared at home was too little. Sir Fan Jr. indeed did not like it. That day, Fan Xian held the child. As he lowered his head to play with the little girl's soft red lips, he said to his father, "I didn't say a word." Minister Fan drank a mouthful of sour berries and said with a slight smile, "I'm about to resign. Who has the patience to go into the palace to say it?" "Shao wa shao." Fan Xian smiled at his father and then lowered his head to coax the child. During this month, he had held the girl every day. He truly loved her more and more. Minister Fan glanced at him and suddenly said, "Although the emperor has an edict for you to rest, you've already rested for a month. You haven't gone to the Overwatch Council Yamen for a single day. What exactly are you hiding from?" Fan Jian's heart jumped. He was afraid that his father would see through his thoughts. He smiled and said, "When I can hide, I should hide. After marrying Wanner, other than when I was injured in the Hanging Temple, I haven't had such leisure days." When he mentioned the Hanging Temple, the corner of his mouth trembled slightly, but his father did not notice. During this month, he had hidden in the manor and refused to go to the Overwatch Council for one reason. He was very afraid of running into Chun Pingping. If he did run into Chun Pingping, he was afraid he wouldn't be able to resist asking him some things to confirm certain things. Although the old cripple would still choose to remain silent and separate out of love for him, if the old and young actually met, how would they interact? There were many things the emperor did not understand, but Fan Xian gradually saw them clearly. The clearer he saw, the colder his heart became, and the more worried he became. Just like this, a few days of leisure passed. Autumn grew stronger in Jingdo, and the weather grew colder and colder. Jingdo grew more and more stable, and the palace grew more and more peaceful. Most of the eunuchs and serving girls had survived and continued to serve people. Eunuch Dai, who had been reinstated, secretly sent out a message saying that some of the people Sir Fan Jr. asked about were alive and some were dead. He was very moved and said that only Sir Fan Jr. would care for these pitiful people like this. He then thought of how he had been in the past, and so on. Asking for a few names was actually just a pretense. Fan Xian only wanted to confirm Hong Zhu's punishment. However, the other news Eunuch Dai spoke of made his expression freeze. Tomorrow, the palace was going to issue an edict. Fan Xian was well aware of the contents of the edict. The emperor's goal in offering sacrifices to heaven was to depose the crown prince. This edict had finally been issued. It only proved one thing. The person in the Eastern Palace perhaps that person had already left for many days. No one knew. Fan Xian lowered his head and drank his tea. He did not say a word. There was no sorrow on his face. It was so calm it made one's heart palpitate. Lin Wanner watched his expression from the side and knew what he was thinking about. Carefully she asked, "What's wrong?" "Tomorrow, I'm going into the palace," Fan Xian said quietly to her. "There are some things I need to report to the emperor." Lin Wanner gazed at him worriedly. Fan Xian comforted her and said, "It's nothing big. I just promised someone something." There were 340 Jingdo officials involved in the rebellion. Adding on their subordinates, trusted aides, and family members, the emperor had captured 4,000 people. The Overwatch Council's prison had long been full. The Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court were also stuffed full of people. In the end, even the Western Academy of the Imperial College had been moved out to be used to lock up criminals. According to Qing law, those who rebelled would have their entire family executed. Even if there were cases of mercy outside of the law, it would probably still cost 2,000 or 3,000 heads. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He thought to himself, if it was the him of the past, perhaps these 2,000 or 3,000 heads would have fallen. What did it have to do with him? However, having lived to this day, he had long understood some principles. At least, He had to do what he promised someone. Furthermore, looking at the situation this month, the emperor's actions were becoming gentler and gentler. Fan Xian had some confidence that at least a few of those women and children would be able to live. Putting aside whether it was a blessing or not, just the crown prince's surrender had allowed the Qing kingdom's soldiers to live a few thousand more. Fan Xian had to repay this thought. Early the next morning, Fan Xian tidied up his official robes. A thought occurred to him. He turned around and picked up a piece of cloth to put in his clothes. This piece of cloth had Fan Xiaohua's red footprints on it when she was 1 month old. At the time, everyone in the manor had felt that Fan Xian's actions were strange. They had not thought that he was just reminiscing about the customs of many years ago. Now, he was taking this piece of cloth to prepare to attack the emperor's heart. Once he was ready, he climbed into the carriage. Unexpectedly, he saw the familiar person across the street smiling at him. Fan Xian lowered his head to look at his black Overwatch Council robes and then at the pure white clothing the person wore. In a low voice, he said, "I said I won't go, so I won't go. Even if you come every day pretending to be white impermanence and pull me, I still won't go." Yin Bingyan walked over with a slight smile on his cold face. "This is the director's intention. As a subordinate, I can only come and bother you every day. Are you going to enter the palace? Since you can enter the palace, you have to return to the council to handle council affairs. There's no need to wait for the director to go to the palace to ask for an edict." Fan Xian spat on the ground and suddenly thought of the matter of entering the palace. Furrowing his brows, he said a few words in a low voice beside Yin Bingyun's ear. Yin Bingyan looked at him with slight surprise. He thought that everyone had the right to punish traitors. Additionally, this matter was carried out according to Qing law. The emperor had not done anything overboard. Why did the commissioner have to enter the palace to admonish? He looked at Fan Xian like he was looking at a monster. Shaking his head, he said, "The council did not randomly capture people. Those people were definitely not wronged. I do not understand when your heart became so gentle." Chapter 590. How come you have time to come into the palace to see me today? The emperor raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian with a smile. There was a glimmer of mockery in his warm gaze. It looked like after a month, the emperor's mood had calmed down a great deal. For no reason, a glimmer of fear rose in Fan Xian's heart. He forced a smile and was speechless. Although this month's leave had been personally given by the emperor, not entering the palace for an entire month and not seeing the emperor was indeed inexcusable. Clearly hearing the emperor's displeasure, he didn't know how to respond. He didn't enter the palace because of the glimmer of coldness and fear in his heart. Ever since he knew the emperor was a great grandmaster, Fan Xian, who had always been daring, finally understood what fear was. Particularly, the emperor's silence and tolerance these few days made him even more wary. If possible, he would rather never enter the royal palace again and never see the emperor's face again. The gentler he was, the more afraid he was. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva to moisten his dry throat. In a low voice, he sincerely spoke of the matter he had come to the palace to ask for. However, he didn't mention Crown Prince Li Chengqian's name. He only discussed the matter as it stood and urged the emperor to be merciful when dealing with the matter of the rebellion. The victor was always tolerant. The emperor, who had lost a large number of his family members, was becoming more and more lenient. Fan Xian thought to himself. Furthermore, he was confident that someone as powerful as the emperor would not worry about the problem of a new life coming with the spring wind. Unexpectedly, the emperor's expression gradually darkened. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would ask for such a thing on his rare visit to the palace. A thick coldness flashed through his eyes. Fan Xian secretly glanced at the emperor's gaze and thought to himself that things were going to be bad. Even if things were going to be bad, he still stubbornly persisted. It was not only because of what Li Chengqian had asked before his death. This also concerned his own courage. If it wasn't for this matter that made him find a glimmer of courage, he probably wouldn't have dared to enter the palace again. Thus, he had to persist. It was because of this persistence that the royal study appeared very lively and terrifying. Eunuch Yao and the other eunuchs on duty outside the royal study paled in fright at the angry cursing coming from inside the room. They didn't know what Sir Fan Jr. had done to make the emperor so angry. Everyone listened nervously and fearfully outside the royal study. It was the sound of teacups crashing to the ground and bones shattering. Then, it was the sound of Sir Fan Jr. kowtowing, the emperor's cursing, and the sound of two people arguing. Eunuch Yao's expression did not change, but huge waves rolled in his heart. He thought to himself that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed daring to go head-to-head with the emperor. He couldn't help but worry about what would happen in a moment. He carefully stared at the door and wondered if he should quickly notify the two scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. So many people had died in the royal palace. Of the people alive, there were only a few who had the right to mediate the dispute between the emperor and the Duke of Donbua. Before long, the two doors to the royal study were pushed open with a squeak. Fan Xian walked out with quick steps. His face carried an expression of anger and indignation. He didn't even glance at the eunuchs with their heads lowered outside. With a wave of his sleeves, he left the royal palace. Once he left the palace and got into the carriage, the anger and indignation on his face immediately disappeared. There was calm and slight worry between his brows. Of course, the emperor had severely reprimanded Fan Xian. No emperor, even those who were known to be the most benevolent, would have a sliver of sympathy for enemies who dared to plot for power in the world. Fan Xian should have thought this through clearly. He just didn't understand why the emperor still wanted to fight like this. After returning to his manor for a few days, there was still no news from the palace. There was also no edict to reprimand him. Fan Xian felt more and more uneasy. He thought that the emperor had probably guessed his intentions and had played a dirty trick on him. However, he had no other choice. He could only use his identity as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council to write a few secret memorials and continuously send them into the palace in an attempt to anger the emperor again. Unexpectedly, these secret memorials were like meat buns and big dogs. Clay Bodhisat was entering the river. There was not a single response. After a few more days, the palace finally settled on how to deal with the matter of rebellion. Fan Xian held the edict in his manor and felt greatly shocked and surprised. He had not thought that after his argument with the emperor in the royal study, the emperor would actually listen to him and raise the butcher's knife high only to gently bring it down. Among the captured rebel officials, as well as some people who had not been released, there were over 1,000 people sentenced to death by beheading. The women and children who had been implicated in the matter were basically dealt with lightly. Even for the rebel soldiers who had surrendered in the end, the emperor only chose generals of a certain rank and above to be killed. As for the common soldiers, they were scattered and sent to the various borders to fight for the country as prisoners on death row, with the intention of atoning for their crimes by performing meritorious deeds. In the end, it was calculated that about 2,000 people had died because of the rebellion. This had already greatly exceeded Fan Xian's best judgment, particularly the families of the officials who had committed crimes according to Qing law. Most of them had been demoted a rank and dealt with. This made his mood very good. While he was very good, he was also confused. Why did the emperor do this? If it was truly because of the effect of his remonstrance, why did he have such a big temper in the royal study that day? The conflict between the emperor and Sir Fan Jr. in the royal study had long shocked the entire Jingdo. After all, there were many people in the palace, and it was impossible to hide this matter from everyone. Long before the emperor made the edict, most of the officials knew the inside story of this matter. Although the officials all had their own camps, they all knew that if the crown prince took the throne, it would probably be difficult for them to escape death. After all, they had all been officials in the same court for many years. There was always a sorrowful feeling of things hurting their own kind, particularly those innocent family members implicated in this matter. Thus, when they saw the emperor's extremely benevolent edict, they all sighed with emotion. In particular, the two leading scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs were full of praise for the emperor's edict. From the depths of their hearts, they praised the emperor endlessly. A benevolent ruler was the foundation of the world. Zhuang Mohan's disciples and grand disciples deeply agreed. Why was the emperor so benevolent? Of course, it was because of Sir Fan Jr. Sir Fan Jr. disregarded his personal honor and power and bravely admonished the emperor in the royal study. Although it was not to the extent of gambling with his entire family's life, he had still taken a considerable risk. Thinking of this matter, the Jingdo court couldn't help but regard Fan Xian even more highly. They felt that he was indeed worthy of being Master Zhuang's successor. His way of doing things was very old-fashioned. Those who had luckily escaped death were all secretly grateful to Fan Xian. For a moment, Fan Xian's clean name once again rang out in Jingdo. Back then, he had always been the idol in the hearts of the scholars. However, because of his identity in the Overwatch Council, as well as the palace's wariness of Prime Minister Lin, he had gradually pulled away from the clear stream. However, his reputation among the people was still very good. Furthermore, after this incident, the officials also felt great admiration for him. After all, not everyone dared to go against the emperor, particularly when it concerned a rebellion. Even Shu Wu the scholar maintained his silence. Fan Xian had not thought that this matter would bring him so many benefits. Originally, he had only wanted to return some of Li Chengqian's kindness and, at the same time, anger the emperor to see if he could make his father, whom he feared so much, show some kindness and let him go. Unexpectedly, the emperor had long seen through his thoughts and played such a trick to raise Fan Xian up again. Even if he wanted to resign, it would be impossible. Fan Xian's face was heavy in the manner as he looked at his daughter. He thought to himself that he had indeed become much lazier with the emperor. However, he still didn't understand why the emperor had given him such glory with both hands. After thinking about it, he felt a bit annoyed. He slammed the table and stood up. Gritting his teeth, he said, "I even dare to enter the palace to see the emperor. Would I be afraid of seeing him?" Fan Xiaohua's eyes were tightly shut, but she did not cry in fright from the loud noise. It was Wan and Cici, who were beside her, who jumped in fright. They didn't know why he was so angry and quickly took the child. After the Jingdo rebellion, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, returned to the Overwatch Council for the first time. All of his subordinates bowed respectfully to welcome him. Their expressions were serious. Through the countless things that had happened these few years, the entire Overwatch Council had completely accepted this future director and were deeply awed by his methods. Fan Xian sat in the dark room and wiped his hands with a wet towel. Pulling back the black cloth, he glanced at the royal palace not far away and shook his head. Chen Pingping was not here, but he could not immediately go to Qin Garden. He summoned a few leaders of the 8 bureaus and asked about the recent situation. He then had Yin Bingyan stay. Hearing his question, Yin Bingyan shook his head and said, "There is still no news of Sir Wang. As for Hong Changqing's group, a few people have returned, but he himself has disappeared. The 7 Tiger Guards Gao de Brat should have all been killed by Sigu Jian on Dong Mountain." Fan Xian's brows gradually furrowed. He felt very uncomfortable in his heart. Logically speaking, Wang Qinian was so cunning. How could he have quietly died on Dong Mountain? Even if a battle between great grandmasters was terrifying, there had to be a corpse. The Overwatch Council knew that Wang Qinian was his most trusted aide, so they shouldn't have missed it. As for Hong Changqing and Gauda, he had no confidence at all. He thought that they had probably really gone. Thinking of this, his mood immediately became gloomy. He didn't linger in the Overwatch Council. Getting into the carriage, he headed straight out of Jingdo and toward Qin Garden. Between the green meadows outside Qin Garden, the usual murderous traps were no longer there. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and thought that the Qin family must have sent the Jingdo garrison to clean them out. After the carriage stopped outside Qin Garden, Fan Xian disembarked and looked at the scene in front of him. He couldn't help but freeze. This was no longer the once beautiful and unique Qin Garden. All he saw were broken walls and ruins, dry ponds and shattered mountains, drooping willows, and traces of fire and smoke. It was a wretched sight. Qin Garden had been burned down, leaving behind a mess. However, it was not too desolate at the moment, because a few temporary houses made of bricks and what had already been built at the back. Moreover, there were already over 1,000 craftsmen busying themselves on the original site. It looked like a bustling construction site. Fan Xian walked through the construction site with great difficulty. With great difficulty, he came to the back of Chun Garden and found Chun Ping, who was being served by a dozen beautiful female attendants and listening to an opera. This old dog was dressed like a landlord. He sat on a low couch with narrowed eyes in enjoyment. His feet were covered by a blanket. Although it was noisy outside and this temporary residence was far from comfortable, looking at his expression, he was very happy. The sound of stone being cut and bricks being laid outside completely suppressed the sounds of the opera inside. Fan Xian walked in and furrowed his brows. How can I hear this clearly? It's not like you don't have a house in the capital. Why must you stay here? It will take at least 3 months for Chun Garden to be completely repaired. Are you going to spend 3 months here? Seeing him walk in, Chun Ping smiled. His smile made his wrinkles bloom like a chrysanthemum flower. Each petal was filled with a strange aura. Fan Xian's hair stood on end because of this smile. He didn't speak. He sat by his side and picked up a teacup to take a sip. The beautiful female attendants who had been glued to Chun Ping's side knew that the little duke had come today to say something important. They did not look at Fan Xian lovingly like they usually did. Restraining their voices and calming their spirits, they withdrew. Outside, there were probably Overwatch Council officials giving orders. Even the sounds of repairing the garden had stopped. The ruins in front and behind Chun Garden all sank into silence. Chun Ping glanced at him. Fan Xian moved closer and used the teacup in his hand to feed him a sip. Chun Ping moistened his throat before saying, "It is not easy to live in Jingdou. It is better to live in this rundown garden." It was not easy to live in Jingdou. This was his reply to Fan Xian's deliberately natural words earlier, but there seemed to be some other meaning hidden within. Fan Xian immediately became unnatural. He knew that this old cripple knew that he had come today because he had something to ask of him. Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, Chun Ping opened his mouth and said, "There are countless beauties in my garden. You know that." Fan Xian nodded. Chun Ping coughed and then continued, "I take them in. They don't have to serve other stinky men. It should be considered a blessing. However, they follow a lonely old man like me every day. Presumably, they are not happy in their hearts. Yet, they don't dare show it in front of me." Fan Xian thought, of course, this is true. In the entire world, other than the emperor, you are the most ruthless. No matter how much these teenage, lawless, and mature women in their 20s are controlled by hormones, they do not dare to have any complaints. There was a serving girl in the previous court who held a hidden grudge for too long. In the end, she strangled the emperor alive. Chun Ping rubbed his neck and said, "I don't want to die like that, so I have to think of a way for the girls in the garden to live more comfortably." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He faintly guessed what the old man wanted to say. "I am very lenient with them. Even if they stare at you like a cucumber every time you come, I won't punish them." Chun Ping yawned and said, "Furthermore, the reason they are dead set on me is that if one day they don't want to stay, I will chase them out of the garden. Leniency is the best way to maintain a garden." Chun Ping looked at Fan Xian and said, "It is also the best way to maintain a family's peace. That is why the emperor has been so gentle recently." Fan Xian understood. Chun Ping was probably using this method to persuade the emperor. "But I can casually let them out of the garden because there are too many beauties with unfortunate backgrounds in the world." Chun Ping gazed at Fan Xian and shook his head. "But the emperor will not let you out because he only has a few sons. Furthermore, 2 of them have just died." The old cripple extended 2 fingers and looked at Fan Xian with slight mockery. "Do you think that by standing up for the crown prince and those rebellious officials, you can truly anger the emperor and make him chase you far away? Don't be too optimistic. Such clumsy methods, who can you fool? The emperor scolded you in the royal study not because he blamed you for pleading for those sinful officials. Rather, he blamed you for wanting to escape at this time." Fan Xian sighed. Right now, he was afraid just looking at the emperor. How could he continue to stay in Jingdou? Thinking of that matter, he lowered his voice and asked with vexation, Even if the emperor saw through my little thoughts, why did he have to play that game in the end? He sent down so many benevolent edicts. Isn't all on my head? Benevolent edicts and reputation are shackles. The emperor can't bear for you to leave. Chen Pingping coughed again and suddenly laughed. He examined Fan Xian's bitter face with great interest. Have you never thought about why the emperor would harm himself to help your reputation? Fan Xian's heart chilled. He thought of a possibility he had never thought of. His entire body froze. Sitting by the edge of the bed, he shivered. Seeing that he finally understood, Chen Pingping sighed and looked through the glass window of the temporary residence at the construction site outside. Then, he slowly said he finally understood after so many people died. It's not in vain that I've spent so many years of effort. Fan Xian's lips trembled slightly. He suddenly rose and looked at Chen Pingping. What about the third prince? The third prince, he is, after all, still young. Chen Pingping lowered his eyes slightly. The emperor will not make a crown prince. However, if something happens and he leaves too early, choosing you to succeed is, of course, the best choice right now. My surname is Fan. I paid respects to the ancestors of the Fan family. Fan Xian's angry voice grew louder and louder. Chen Pingping glanced outside and furrowed his brows. Why are you so loud? Not everything in this world can be justified by sound alone. Whoever has the biggest fist is justified. The emperor's fist is the biggest. As for whether your surname is Li or Fan in the future, isn't it all up to him? Fan Xian sat down dejectedly. He had no idea that there was such a big matter hidden behind the emperor's recent warmth and benevolence. Given the emperor's present state, this matter may only happen after many years. Perhaps when the third prince grows up, the emperor will like him more than you. This matter will disappear with the wind. In any case, other than the emperor, you, and me, no one else will know. Chen Pingping seemed to have thought of something. His expression dimmed slightly. He looked at Fan Xian for a moment, and then said, You haven't entered the palace for a month. It seems you have some opinions about the emperor. Why are you hiding? Why did he hide from the emperor? It was because of the fear in his heart. Fan Xian faintly said, I'm afraid. What are you afraid of? Chen Pingping looked at him and slowly said, It's already been 4 years. You've already proven your loyalty to the emperor and obtained a rare trust. This was obtained at the price of almost dying a few times. You should confidently enjoy this kind of trust. Fan Xian was silent. After he entered the capital from Danzhou, he had indeed almost lost his life a few times. Regardless of whether it was the Hanging Temple, the Valley, or the Dong Mountain incident, no matter how he looked at it, the emperor did not suspect him at all. The reason the emperor trusted Chen Pingping so much was because Chen Pingping had once risked his life to save the emperor's life a few times. What kind of trust was the most solid? Naturally, it was to sacrifice himself for the emperor. Regardless of other matters, just based on the emperor's attitude toward you, it can be said that it is not bad. Think carefully about these years. The emperor has shown you a lot of favor. You should be grateful. Other matters? Fan Xian heard these words and didn't think too deeply about it. He thought about the palace treasury, the Overwatch Council, and the power and trust in his hands. Compared to the crown prince and the second prince, Fan Xian knew that the emperor's treatment of him was not as simple as making up for the regret of not seeing him for 16 years. Since ancient times, the emperor's family was heartless. Furthermore, he was only an illegitimate child. The emperor had many ways to understand what had happened many years ago, but he had chosen the path that was best for Fan Xian. That is why I don't understand what you are afraid of. Why you don't want to enter the palace. Why do you think of a way to escape? Chen Pingping looked at him and said. Fan Xian forced a smile. No matter how much the emperor trusted him and pampered him, he was, in the end, an emperor. Putting aside the matter of decades ago, just his cold-blooded attitude toward the members of the royal family and his incomparably powerful methods made him feel incomparably terrified. Once the emperor knew that he had hidden many things from him and even betrayed him, he would unyieldingly tear apart the father-son relationship and the righteousness of a ruler and official. Ever since he knew that the emperor was a great grandmaster, Fan Xian had begun to worry about one thing. Back then, he had once secretly snuck into the royal palace and stolen the key from Hongguang Palace. If the emperor had sensed this at the time and had endured it until now, what exactly was he thinking? It didn't matter if he smuggled with Northern Qi or took in 13th Wang. The confident emperor did not care about these things at all and would not suspect Fan Xian of treason. However, he would not allow anyone to hold that chest in their hands because that chest could threaten him. Fan Xian was certain of this, but he was not sure whether or not the emperor knew the chest was in his hands. There was a letter missing from the secret compartment under the bed in Hongguang Palace. Could the emperor have taken it? That was why he was terrified the moment he entered the palace. He didn't know where a large group of aces would appear to kill him. He was also worried that the emperor would take action and use the realm of a great grandmaster to smash him into mincemeat. Chapter 591. Yesterday, I made a series of mistakes. First, I wrote in a hurry, resulting in too many typos. Then, when I was editing, I changed the content to the vote solicitation chapter. Fortunately, a book friend reminded me on QQ. Only then did I understand. This is a very annoying matter. As for being accused of changing it to be pretentious, it also made me angry for a while. If this was pretentious, then if I made a mistake in the vote solicitation, wouldn't that make me a fake A? I took a deep breath and immediately forgot about you. The world is so beautiful. I will not be irritable. The vote solicitation chapter had long been deleted yesterday. Now, I can only continue to solicit monthly votes. As the saying goes, sending off a comrade, soliciting monthly votes. Speechless, 2 lines of tears. Third is about to be lost. Friends, please cast monthly votes to support Old Cat. Regardless of whether Fan Xian was afraid or not, the matter had already happened. However, during these years, perhaps the emperor did not want to completely break off relations with the son he admired the most because of this matter. Or perhaps the emperor only knew Fan Xian had entered the palace but did not think the chest was in Fan Xian's hands. Thus, he remained silent. It seemed that this was some kind of tacit agreement, not to pursue the matter, to express a father's indulgence toward his favorite son. Furthermore, Fan Xian was indeed ruthless to himself. Even when faced with a desperate situation, he rarely used that powerful weapon. The only time he had used it was in an uninhabited primitive mountain forest. Additionally, the key in Hongguang Palace's secret compartment was still there, making the emperor guess some things incorrectly. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and sank into deep thought. He thought of the snow-like leaflets and how he had entered the palace to eavesdrop on the conversation between the eldest princess and Zhuang Moan. His heart immediately relaxed. He understood that the emperor must have thought he was only targeting the eldest princess, entering the palace to eavesdrop, and not for the key. But what about the letter? Fan Xian still could not understand. Tiredly, he sat on the side of the bed in silence. In reality, other than the matter of the chest possibly being exposed, his fear of the emperor was also because of another puzzle. This was a problem that troubled Fan Xian. Regardless of whether he accepted it or not, no matter what, the emperor was still one of his fathers, although he was certainly not the best one. In Fan Xian's heart, he had 3 fathers. Minister Fan was his closest biological father, and Chen Pingping could be considered a godfather. However, the emperor's figure was also gradually invading his thoughts. Chen Pingping's words interrupted his train of thought. If you didn't enter the palace because you were afraid, then why didn't you return to the Overwatch Council and see me? Don't tell me you're afraid of me too. Looking at the old cripple's smiling appearance, Fan Xian sighed in his heart and thought, isn't he also afraid? I'm just afraid that after seeing you, I won't be able to resist asking some questions. Although he was afraid, he still opened his mouth to ask. Since he had the courage to come, he was naturally prepared. He did not want to be a pitiful zergling that was kept in the dark. How did Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers get to Dong Mountain? Why didn't the Overwatch Council have any intelligence? Why was the situation in Jingdo so dangerous? Why was there no news of the unusual movements of the officials of Dongshan Road? Why didn't you return to Jingdo and allow the eldest princess and Empress Dowager to torment you until you finally tormented yourself to death? This is the plan that His Majesty and I came up with. Of course, we have to hide it from the world. Chen Pingping glanced at him coldly and said, "If I didn't show weakness first, how could these people jump out?" Fan Xian shook his head. "Don't lie to me. I know you can certainly give the emperor a good explanation after this. Only you and I know that these people were forced by us to oppose the emperor. Furthermore, you know that although the emperor appears to have achieved great success this time, he is actually walking on a tightrope. The slightest bit of carelessness would cause him to fall into the bottomless abyss. Since you knew about this long ago, you must have the ability to make this situation better and not let Jingdo sink into a situation of eternal damnation. The emperor trusts you, but that doesn't mean I trust you." Fan Xian stared at Chen Pingping's old face and lowered his voice. "This is the emperor's plan, but you've been going along with it. Although you've only pushed it a little, it has increased the danger the Qing kingdom faces by 10 times or even 100 times. Even if you want to get rid of internal trouble, you can't have so many people die. No matter how ruthless the emperor is, presumably, he wouldn't want to see this final situation. There are dogs in the world who would chase them." After a long silence, Chen Pingping said, "If you want to beat the dogs, you have to beat them all to death. I'm afraid the emperor's heart will soften for a moment. Does this explanation make sense?" "It doesn't." Fan Xian shifted in his direction and held his thin hand. In a heavy voice, he said, "Even if it makes sense logically, the emperor's heart will not be comfortable, particularly if he thinks about it later. There will always be problems." "What problems could there be?" "This is the emperor's grand plan. I am just an executor." Chen Pingping very naturally pulled his hand out of Fan Xian's and coldly said, "Don't think too much. There aren't too many complicated things in this world." "There aren't?" Fan Xian's heart was filled with worry and anger. He stared into his eyes and said, "Then, tell me, why did you have the shadow assassinate the emperor at the Hanging Temple? Why did the old Qin master's body have an additional wound on the back of his waist?" Chen Pingping slowly raised his head and furrowed his brows as he looked at Fan Xian. "You want to see the body?" Fan Xian nodded and said, "I know that was the shadow's attack." He paused and then smiled bitterly. "However, since I saw it, naturally, there's no wound now." "I didn't think you would be so meticulous," Chen Pingping said. Chen Pingping said, "I was the one who ordered the shadow to attack in the floating temple. You can report me to the king now, but you should know that the shadow has 2 mysterious identities. Aside from you and me, no one else knows this. Not even the king knows." Chen Pingping nodded. Fan Xian angrily said, "Even so, you still won't say it." "Say what?" "Why did the old Qin master betray the emperor?" This was the question the eldest princess had Fan Xian asked Chen Pingping before she died. Now, he finally bravely asked. Betrayal never needs a reason. Chen Pingping was as cold and severe as ever. "You had the shadow kill Qinyi. Were you afraid I would find out something from his mouth?" Chen Pingping laughed coldly and couldn't be bothered to reply. He waved his hand to signal for the guest to leave. Fan Xian stared at him coldly. A moment later, his gaze helplessly softened. Using a pleading tone, he said, "I know you are afraid of dragging me down, which is why you want to separate. However, such a major matter, you have to think about yourself." Chen Pingping's heart was filled with tenderness, but his face did not show it. "You're thinking too much." Fan Xian was silent and speechless. Although Chen Pingping still refused to admit it, he knew from the other party's attitude that his guess was certainly correct. The Qin family must have participated in the Taiping courtyard matter. The reason for their betrayal was because of his rise. What kind of person was the old Qin master? Although he was old, he knew that if the emperor truly wanted to use Fan Xian, he would have to clean up the matter of the past. The Qin family must have died, so the Qin family must have rebelled. This was the logic. However, behind this logic was a bloody and sinister reality. Fan Xian stood and gazed at Chen Pingping in silence for a moment. He then said, "After all, They're my father and mother. You've already worked hard for so many years. You should think about yourself more. I don't have many years left. You've said it yourself. Chen Pingping smiled. Fan Xian gazed at him with some bitterness and said, "No one can defeat him." Chen Pingping was silent. Fan Xian prepared to leave when he suddenly said, "The chest is in my hands." Chen Pingping abruptly raised his head and saw that the young man had already walked resolutely out the door. He couldn't help but shake his head. He thought, "So what if the chest is in your hands? I can't drag you into this matter." After an indeterminable amount of time, a middle-aged man in casual clothing walked into the side room. Chen Pingping was in and sat down beside him. It was exactly where Fan Xian had been sitting earlier. "No one can defeat the emperor," the middle-aged man said evenly. "On this point, my thoughts are the same as in Ji's." This middle-aged man was none other than Fan Xian's father, the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. No one knew when he had come to Qin Garden or why he was speaking so calmly with Chen Pingping. The legend in officialdom was that in the past dozen years, Chen Pingping and Fan Jian had always been like fire and water. It was not until Fan Xian entered the capital that the relationship between the two sides gradually improved. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and calmly said, "Do you know the chest is in his hands?" Fan Jian smiled bitterly and said, "This child, he put the chest under the bed and thought he could hide it from everyone under heaven. How cute." Chen Pingping opened his eyes and glanced at him. "In your own manner, do you not have the ability to help him keep a secret?" "I do have this ability," Fan Jian said evenly. "The emperor has placed 2 spies in my home, and Ji discovered one a long time ago, and the other died a long time ago. In any case, these kinds of spies don't cost money, so the emperor doesn't care." "Doesn't care?" If he didn't care, then he wouldn't have brought all of the tiger guards to Dong Mountain this time for that madman Siga Jian to chop up for fun. Chen Pingping looked at him with slight mockery and said, "You've only cared about small things your entire life. All of your strength was put into those tiger guards. Now that they've all died, no matter how many people you hid inside, not a single one is left. The emperor is truly ruthless this time." "Yes, I don't have much strength left." Fan Jian smiled bitterly. "So, I can only resign and return home." He looked at Chen Pingping and smiled coldly. "How much better can you be than me? During the battle at Jinyang Gate, thousands of your Overwatch Council elites died. In another 2 years, the emperor will add a few more grains of sand. Other than learning from me and retiring, what else can you do?" Chen Pingping laughed coldly and said, "As long as Fan Xian is still alive, the emperor will not go all out against the Overwatch Council. What do I have to worry about? On the other hand, Lin Ruofu, that old fox, has endured for so long and finally found an opportunity to hand over all of the people he had hidden to his precious son-in-law. In the end, he is probably vomiting blood in Wuzhou right now." Fan Jian also smiled and said, "Everyone else thought that the officials of the Lin faction had followed in Ji to fight against the Crown Prince and would be heavily rewarded afterward. Unexpectedly, the emperor had been waiting to see this scene." Seeing the last of Prime Minister Lin's people jump out. Even if they can't do anything now, how can they have a chance to turn things around in the future? External enemies and internal troubles have all been eliminated. He has also chopped off half of our arms. Fan Jian sighed. The emperor can truly be said to be wise and mighty. He has exceptional talent in his heart. It must be admitted, just like when we began to follow him many years ago. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and slowly said, "He is, and will be the most powerful person in the world." After a death-like silence, Minister Fan sighed and said, "I hid in King Jing's manor in Jingdo because I was not worried about the situation in Jingdo. I had long seen that there was a problem with the Yi family. However, I had not thought that the emperor was actually a great grandmaster. I had somewhat guessed at the emperor's unfathomable power," Chen Pingping said coldly. "However, I had not thought that Yi Luyun, that strange old creature, would suddenly stand on the emperor's side. The two of us only guessed one side of the emperor." Minister Fan suddenly stopped talking. Chun Pingping knew what his old comrade was about to say and calmly said, "There is no if. After that matter, you were never willing to believe me, and I was never willing to believe you. I never thought that the person I should have trusted the most might have had some problems." And Ji once said something. Minister Fan said, "If you and I had more trust in each other, perhaps things would have been much easier." It was at that time that I knew this son of mine was extraordinary. We hit it so well, yet he was still able to guess this matter. He is the son of Xiao Yi and the emperor. Of course, he is extraordinary. Chen Pingping furrowed his brows. In his heart, he still had the highest respect and admiration for the emperor. When did you guess that the emperor was a great grandmaster? Minister Fan's heart was very light as he casually asked. It's in a few years. Chun Pingping's brows gradually relaxed as he thought of the events of the past. At that time, the Wei Kingdom was still standing in the center of the land. The power of the country was very powerful. When the Qin Kingdom first went on a northern expedition, the battle was very difficult, particularly in one battle. At the time, the emperor, who was still the crown prince, was heavily injured. His entire body was stiff and unable to move, and he almost lost his life. It was all thanks to Chen Pingping risking his life and going through many hardships to save him. This was one of Chen Pingping's most famous deeds. It was as famous as the Thousand Li surprise attack and the capture of Xiao An at the price of a broken leg. Minister Fan furrowed his brows and said, "What's wrong with that? We old people always thought that it was after that heavy injury that the emperor lost his martial arts." Back then, he was a fierce general. That injury was a bit strange, Chen Pingping slowly said. His entire body was stiff. It was definitely not caused by external injuries. Lady Ning and I took care of him all the way, so of course we know that it should be a problem with his meridians. It seems that all his meridians were broken. We thought he was dead for sure and cried a few times. Who knew that he would come back alive in the end? I've never seen a person who can still live with all his meridians broken. Chen Pingping opened his eyes and looked at Fan Jian. Slowly, he said, "However, I later saw a similar person. It was your son." During the Hanging Temple incident, Fan Xian's meridians were also greatly damaged, but they were not as terrifying as the emperor's in the past. Furthermore, later in Jiangnan, he must have learned old Baldy Ku's skills and gradually recovered, Chen Pingping said. The emperor did not have Fan Xian's good luck. He did not learn Tianyi Dao, so how did his injury heal? These years, you've spent less time with the emperor than I have, Chen Pingping continued. No matter how much the emperor can endure, some details will always give the game away. Fei Jie reported back from Danzhou about the tyrannical martial method Fan Xian practiced and said that this tyrannical jinqi could cause serious consequences. It made me think of the emperor who was once stiff all over and looked like a cripple. The Hanging Temple incident wanted to force him a little and see what his trump card was. Unfortunately, it was blocked by Fan Xian. Speaking of this, he glared at Minister Fan. At that time, it was this father who wanted his son to save the emperor and instead ruined Chun Pingping's grand plan. Since you understand everything, then let's not talk about it anymore. You also have to think through this matter. Fan Jian stood freely and said, "I'm going back to Danzhou to retire. If you have time, you can come visit me." Chen Pingping was silent. He knew what his old comrade was thinking. Regardless of whether or not the emperor was undefeatable, he was, in the end, Fan Xian's biological father. No one knew that Fan Xian was a transmigrator. His soul carried a different element. These two elders only thought, based on common sense, that even if Fan Xian knew the truth, he would still be stuck in a dilemma. The two of them didn't want Fan Xian to live under too much pressure, so they had to think through this matter. Chen Pingping gently knocked on the copper bell beside the table. After a crisp ring, the old servant who had served him for many years walked in and carried him to the wheelchair. "I'll see you off." Chen Pingping lowered his head and coughed. It was a difficult cough. His sleeves were covered in spittle. It took a moment for it to calm down. He said self-mockingly, "My body is getting worse and worse. I've been poisoned, and I can't cure it for a long time." Fan Jian looked at him quietly and didn't say anything. He walked out of the manor. Behind him, the old servant pushed the wheelchair and followed. They didn't walk very far. In front of the construction site, the two of them stopped, looked at each other, and bowed. "I've thought it through," Qin Pingping said to Fan Jian. Fan Jian didn't immediately reply. Instead, he lowered his head and thought for a moment. He didn't know if these words were true or false. He knew why Qin Pingping had come to see him off. Many years ago, they had once gone to the shores of the East Sea and gathered together in Taiping Courtyard. They had once created a great situation. However, as time passed, some people had died, some people had changed, and some people had to retreat. He had resigned and returned to Danzhou. Only Qin Pingping was left in Jingdou to accompany the emperor. Presumably, he should also feel lonely. Just as Fan Xian said, during these dozen years, he and Qin Pingping had suspected each other. Their interactions had gradually decreased, but it could not erase the comradeship of the past. When it was time to withdraw from the stage, it had to be completely withdrawn. Back then, Lin Ruofu was not a member of the three-man group, so his withdrawal was not thorough enough. Minister Fan would not make this mistake. In front of the emperor's might, other than retiring, they did not seem to have any good choice. Before Fan Jian left, he furrowed his brows and asked one last question. He did not avoid the old servant. "Since you suspected me back then, why did you have Wu Zhu take him to Danzhou?" Qin Pingping sat in the wheelchair and lowered his head for a moment. He then slowly replied, "Because I know you once paid a price for it, so I want to continue to see your heart." A self-mocking and sad smile rose to the corners of Fan Jian's lips. He waved his hand and didn't say anything more. Watching Fan Jian's departing figure, Qin Pingping gently leaned against the wheelchair. His finger unconsciously tapped against the armrest of the wheelchair. He sighed and quietly said, "It's good that he's gone. It's good that he's gone." Immediately after, the leader of the Qin Kingdom's darkness said gloomily to himself, "In the end, he is his father. How could I bear to force him?" The old servant silently pushed the wheelchair back and listened to the old director say tiredly, "Tell me, why is it so difficult for someone to die?" Qin Pingping had done countless earth-shattering things in his life and faced countless dangers and hardships, but he had never been as disappointed as he was today. The enemy he faced was, without question, the most powerful person he had ever met in his life. Furthermore, that person could not find any weakness. The old servant said in a raspy voice, "It shouldn't implicate the Duke." He could already see the heaviness in his master's heart, so he did his best to ease it. Even if the emperor can find something, after the Hanging Temple and in Little Snow Valley, I have already caused Ji to almost lose his life twice. Is this still not enough to sever my relationship with him? And Ji's luck has always been good. The emperor will certainly not suspect him. Let's just let this matter rest. Qin Pingping was slightly afraid of the cold and pulled the blanket closer to his body. Fan Jian was ready to leave. Qin Pingping had given up, and Fan Xian had thought it through. The biggest problem in the world seemed to have been solved. However, all three of them knew that if there were no major disturbances in the future, then this pot of boiling oil could be safely covered by the lid. But if something were to happen, the oil would jump out and burn everything cleanly, not to mention the fact that the boiling oil was in their hearts, and it would burn them to the point where they hissed in pain. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.